Our story begins in the garden of a grand mansion surrounded by fragrant flowers. The sunlight reflects off the flowing, clear water in the fountains and illuminates the dazzling white chambers of the noble family. In this garden, the young man, awkwardly clutching and rubbing his hands together below, stood humbly before the beautiful maiden Lila. He should have confessed something to her long ago. The blonde lady in the lilac fishnet dress waited impatiently for the stuttering young man to speak a word. As the boy named Refons talked about how he'd been feeling since he'd started working at the mansion, Lila was glad he was finally coming clean. Refons spoke in embarrassment about how every day he looked at the incredible sunset opening up from the garden, but his thoughts were on something else entirely. Lila was disappointed. Indeed, the sun was already setting over the horizon, and they were still standing there, unable to admit to each other. She decided to take the initiative. Making an innocent face, the girl put her hand to her mouth, expressing her disappointment. She was so intrigued, but it seemed that was all the guy could tell her. Lila hinted to the guy with a question that perhaps this could be their last meeting. Refons was puzzled how it was possible, but the girl was ready to confess to him first. And then the guy blurted out, putting his hands to his chest, and as if from the bottom of his heart, confessed his feelings to Lila. Then the girl smiled softly and took Refons' hand, linking the fingers of her hands together. With ease and embarrassment, she replied that the boy had always been in her heart. But suddenly the mental picture broke off like a vision. A bed appeared in front of us, on which an unknown red-haired girl lay next to a man shining with joy. She had returned. He was sitting on a chair next to me, his hand resting on his cheek. He was already having his 10th dream, and it was so exciting that his mouth was watering. The stranger was outraged that her assistant had fallen asleep right in the middle of work. So she crouched on the bed and grabbed her throat, pretending to choke, and started screaming at her partner Terry for help. The boy woke up and rose hastily from his chair. He was in such a hurry that he stumbled and fell to the floor in his sleep, while the girl peered out from under his palm. The girl waved at the satisfied grandfather. She slammed the door shut, leaned back against it, and exhaled, rubbing her shoulder. Her body felt like it was begging for rest after such a long session. But her partner, Terry, knew how to make things right. There was a grand table waiting for her at the house, filled with the most delicious dishes one could wish for: fish and meat steaks, salads and sweets. All for Mrs. Sonidor. Terry was glad they hadn't stayed up all night, which angered his mistress, who clung to him. Clearly he should have been concerned about her condition, not such trivialities. He asked Sonidor how Sonidor had managed to get the shy grandfather to confess his feelings to his beloved. The red-haired girl replied that she was a dream maker, and that she could do more than that. Terry mused that if he too were a native of a certain Descentia, he too, like his mistress, would boast of an amazing ability, and there, lo and behold, he'd be working for the Knights of Riesel instead of all that. Sonidor asked irritably if he was implying that he didn't like working with her, to which the guy replied, waving off that it was just a had to be said. Descentia was the name of a southern island where people with unique abilities were born for some unknown reason. No one knew if it was due to powerful mana or the divine blessing of the Holy Land. The abilities of these people varied both in origin and application. They would not equal real magic, but the natives of Descentia were just as highly regarded in society, so peace and prosperity did not last long on the island. The men in authority issued a decree that from now on, every such person was the property of the empire. They would be given new names and called into service as masters to work for Arcay. So much for the main character's name actually being an acronym. Sonidor stood for dream, filled with precious shards of reality. That was the original meaning of the name her mother had given her. It was a mouthful for her ability to fulfill a person's impossible fantasies by invading their dreams through touch. Sonidor was known as a dream maker, helping people's dreams come true, if only in their dreams. She was happy with her situation, better than being a slave. There were plenty of people willing to dream such dreams, so there was no need to starve to death, and the last time was just as well paid. But the joy was interrupted when the black-clad men suddenly burst into the master's chambers. They looked serious and menacing, as if they had not come to her for help. One of the men asked if the Dream Master was here to practice her skills. Terry hurried to tell him that the day was over and said goodbye, but he was interrupted by a shout from one of the men in black behind him. The boy didn't know who he was talking to. Then the man who spoke first took off his hood, revealing a noble face like that of an aristocrat. He said that he needed the help of a master to awaken someone who would not wake up. It was his son, who had not awakened for a long time. The story of the appearance of the gifted in the empire began when 500 years ago, the greedy ruler of the Archaea Empire, Luke V, declared war on Descentia, a true mana mine on the border with the imperial lands. He wished punishment for anyone who opposed the laws and orders of the state. And then scarlet blood soaked the ground, and piercing screams deafened all around. From everywhere the gifted begged for mercy as they watched their loved ones being lost. But the strongest sorceress of Descentia, watching her house being turned into ruins, frantically shouted a curse to all the attackers, that they were beasts born without the blessing of heaven, and earth would disown them, as would heaven at the end of their journey. Luke V did not listen to her words, taking them for delusions before his death, but after the empire was in chaos. All the descendants of the imperial line were born weak after all the bloody events, and on the day of their majority, they fell into a dreamless sleep. This dream continued until his death. In the end, the imperial family lost all its heirs and was cut off. The Duke of Pylon came to the throne and managed to win the favour of the people during the troubled times. He changed his name to Archaea and became a full ruler. It appeared that the emperor himself was standing in front of Sidor and Terry. The girl pinched her cheek to see if she was still awake, but everything was happening. Then His Majesty suggested that they leave the formalities behind and get right down to business. Terry whispered to his mistress that his adored knights Riesel were also in front of them. He couldn't contain his joy, but Sidor didn't care at all. They were in big trouble, so they should have talked things over tea first. She sent her partner to fetch the drink. Over tea, the emperor asked if the girl could awaken his child from his eternal sleep. The court physician said that his condition was like a coma, but in fact, it was a deep sleep. Naturally, the emperor was talking about the heir himself. Sidor said that, unfortunately, she couldn't help, as direct contact with a person was necessary to use her power. But she, an ordinary craftswoman, could not touch His Highness so easily, considering it an insult to a noble and great family. That was a problem, but there was no choice either. The emperor sighed and said that Sidor was their last hope, therefore he would accept anything in this situation. He promised to pay any money for her success. However, if she suddenly refused, he could not guarantee her safety and integrity, for she now knew the secret of the emperor himself. Well, she could indeed refuse, but only at the cost of her own life. So she had a choice to make. The girl realized that her situation was quite deplorable and hopeless. It seemed that the 500-year-old curse was still working. The duke's son had been weak in body and mind since birth, and on the day of his majority, he fell asleep. His Majesty added that he had heard rumours of a craftswoman curing the insomnia of a count's wife. Sidor realised he was talking about Lady Vishtia, and grinned proudly, remembering her brilliant work. The emperor realised that if the master could cure insomnia, she would surely be able to cope with the opposite case without difficulty. But Sidor could not understand the comparison between the illness and the ancient curse. The girl wondered how a mere Descensian could help if His Highness had indeed been struck by the same curse. But the emperor was sure that her origin gave her a number of advantages. His Majesty waited for Sidor's verdict. Terry pestered and with fire in his eyes begged his mistress to agree. But the girl was in a state of floundering. If she refused, she would lose her head, and if she agreed, she would lose her sleep. But in the second case, she would at least prolong her existence. To fill the silence, the emperor began to promise the girl a title at court, which was very honourable for a master. He was obviously desperate to offer such regalia to a master from the island. Terry was right, and that gave the girl an idea. Sidor gave up her title and conditioned herself to agree to help if the emperor promised to grant freedom and safety to all the islanders. She couldn't ask for the same rights as the natives of the empire, but that didn't matter. In the state of Archaea, masters were not even considered as cattle. They had to endure mockery and insults only because of their foreign origin. In the worst case, they could even be killed without bearing any punishment or judgment on their shoulders. Therefore, the girl demanded that the masters should be able to leave the empire freely and at will. She could earn money herself, and this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The demand was impertinent, and Sonidor had already prepared herself for the death sentence. But the emperor unexpectedly gave his consent. If the girl would really deliver the only heir of the empire from the curse, such a reward would be commensurate. For Sonidor's success, he promised to shower her with money and grant the masters the independence they desired. She was to keep the curse from taking root in the empire again. The very mountain of money in the emperor's understanding was equivalent to 10 billion bucks. The girl was flattered by such generosity that she fell into the arms of her partner in delirium. His Majesty added that Terry would also be able to take lessons from one of the knights, after which the lad himself had already fallen into the arms of the lady. But the girl had one more request for the emperor. In order to wake up the crown prince, she needed to know a lot about his surroundings or childhood, and since the duke was his father, he could share the information. But he had nothing to tell. All he could give was a pathetic document with information about the prince, which after reading it, he ordered to be burned immediately. The bare facts were completely useless. Sonidor needed to know more about his preferences and various little things in life. For example, his favorite weather and time of day would help create the right atmosphere in his dreams. But the emperor didn't seem to know any of this, calling the girl's wishes nonsense. It was amazing to the master how the birth father could not know such things about his child. In these matters, the heir's nurse might be of assistance. The girl had already lit up with excitement, hoping for her salvation and an easy job. But the duke finished with the story of the execution of this lovely aunt, who was the consort of the Marquis of Ambrose. She was not in the habit of keeping her mouth shut, which was dangerous to the reputation and safety of the imperial family. With dying hope, Sonidor asked about the heir's friends. There had to be at least one. But after an awkward silence, the last drop of hope was destroyed. The emperor declared that the prince had no friends either. But there was nothing to do. And after a while, the girl was painfully choosing her image, in which she would go to the palace. She could not decide on her hairstyle or her attire. Eventually, she came out to Terry in her usual form, asking if she looked good. The boy noted that her hair looked shabby, and it was embarrassing to go to the palace in a dress like that. The girl dismissed the fact that the meeting would be unofficial, and therefore there was no need to try. She admitted that she had originally wanted to wear a new dress and style her hair, but the usual clothes were more comfortable. And the fact that she ironed her clothes and combed her hair was enough. The boy sighed and gave his verdict. Something had to be done about that mound of hair. He took charge of his mistress's image, and in a few minutes she was glowing in her new dress and with her hair spritzed with scented oils. Looking at herself in the mirror, Sonidor agreed that it was worth dressing up, for this day might be her last. She was only hungry for the last piece of chicken from Aunt McLean, and then she could die without regret. A knock on the door interrupted my reverie about food. The tall and formidable figure of a knight appeared on the doorstep and said it was time to leave. His Majesty had given them plenty of time to take care of all their business before they left, so they might be delayed. The girl was indignant, realizing that the man had been standing outside the door all this time and had heard everything. But in response, the knight only turned and went on his way, and the girl hurried after him. In town, Sonidor bought a bag of fish-shaped sweet rolls and ate them greedily on the way. She wondered if she should say goodbye to Joe now that she had the chance. Her companion's full name sounded like Giorgio. He was also from Descentia and was a childhood friend and family to Sonidor. But unlike the soft and calm red-haired girl, he had a hard and fiery temper, so he easily lost his temper at the sight of an arrogant resident of the empire boasting about his origins. Besides, there were rumors that the Descentians were gathering an army of like-minded people, a revolutionary movement for freedom, the leader of which was Joe himself. And if she contacted him right now, all plans would be ruined, so the girl postponed the idea. Instead, she decided to ask the knight if he had any food preferences. Nothing like a meal together, her mother had always told her. The knight immediately said no. Sonidor said it was a waste, because she had a lot of interesting places in mind. She wanted to fill her belly for the last time, and she remembered the pastry shop across the street from her apartment, where they served delicious cherry cakes. "I don't think you'll find one in the palace, but the palace pastry chefs are better than the imperial city pastry chefs. Then Sonidor asked about food that could not be tasted within the palace walls. She lured the knight into her aunt's shop to treat him to that delicious chicken. The man was amazed at how so much food could fit into such a small girl, since she had just recently devoured a whole bag of buns. A bottomless stomach, no other way to put it. The girl ordered the chicken in pink sauce, which had just recently appeared. The knight didn't object and took off his hood at that moment, which hid a stern but exactly model-like face. The ashy hair only emphasized the features of the man's face, and the scars, as society believed, adorned him. The girl looked the knight over and finally let out a question, whether imperial knights are not chosen by appearance, which offended her companion very much. He had to apologize. But just then, an appetizing dish was served, and Sonidor pounced on the food as if she hadn't eaten in days. While she was busy eating, she decided to ask the knight about the prince, but he didn't know much about him, saying that he obeyed his majesty personally. The girl lowered her head, realizing that there was nothing to catch her here either. Prince Marmel was the perfect heir to Ark. He was blessed with both a beautiful appearance and an outstanding mind, which was especially valuable to the empire. He had all the noble traits of his late mother and father, and if anyone finds out that the last hope of the state has fallen asleep, the turmoil of 500 years ago will resume, so the current state of the prince is carefully concealed. And the dream mistress has also been unofficially hired, so she couldn't just show up at the palace with Terry. Sonidor had an excellent idea on that score. She could have pretended to be a servant, eager to try on the maid's outfit, but the knight immediately brought her back down to earth. They didn't have much time, and training would take time. The only way to enter the palace undetected was through a secret passage through which the knight must guide the master with her partner. The trio was ready to depart. Adjusting his glove, the knight asked if they were ready to go, but Sonidor had one last place to visit. The girl turned around and headed off to finish one last thing. The company came to the cemetery. The knight could not understand why the girl needed to visit such a gloomy place just before leaving. But it was here that Sonidor's mother's grave was located, and it was necessary to say goodbye to her. Sonidor really wanted to ask her for advice, if only her mother were alive, for she knew so much more about their family gift. The knight realized that the girl was all alone in the world, since the only person she had come to say goodbye to was her late mother, one master of dreams for the whole empire. His Majesty was right in saying that everything now depended solely on her. She had not felt such pressure of responsibility on her shoulders for a long time. She looked at the tombstone with tears in her eyes and remained silent, pondering her last words. The knight wished Sonidor to brace herself and hold on, for in her hands was the fate of an entire empire, as well as the masters who would gain long-awaited freedom if she succeeded. He was right, and Sonidor understood that very well. She apologized to her mother for such a bold and dangerous decision, and then set off with her company. The beaten sandy road lay far away through the forest. It seemed as if the slender trees growing in rows would never end, but suddenly the carriage stopped, and the knight invited the girl and her partner to get out. The secret passage was somewhere around here, but there were only bushes around. No wonder the girl couldn't see anything, since the passage was enchanted. There couldn't be a secret passage in plain sight. The knight waved his fingers in the air, tracing a magic glowing seal and reciting an unknown spell. Immediately a fairy door appeared in the wall, where before there had been only stones and branches. The knight ordered to pass through, but to stay close to him so as not to get lost. The dark tunnel seemed endless, and only the faint light from the lantern illuminated the way. Sonidor joked wryly that they were now crawling like ants through secret passages underground. The knight was outraged by such a ridiculous and dubious comparison, because the place they were in was still part of the palace, so he asked her not to use that kind of language anymore. He's a bore, she thought. Finally, the travellers arrived at another unknown door. The knight pointed there and told the dream mistress to go through, but only alone. The plan was clear, but Sonidor didn't want to go into the dark corridor. But there was nothing to do. It was necessary to go downstairs, where there would be a room where the knight would bring his highness for treatment. The door slammed shut behind the girl, who in a panic began to knock desperately and demand the promised dinner. But there was already silence outside. Overcoming her fear, the girl nevertheless reached the right room. It was more like the rich decorations worthy of an imperial family. Sonidor had imagined a dank dungeon as her quarters, but she had been assigned a part of the palace. Tiredly, she took a seat at the table and waited. She pondered if Terry would be able to pull off her part of the plan. They were going to use the polymorph artifact to turn him into a fake prince, so that the disappearance of His Real Highness would not be noticed. While Terry is busy averting his eyes, Sonidor will do the treatment. But could he do it with his acting skills? He was talentless in her eyes, but sometimes he was good at something. There was the sound of footsteps. The girl stood up, realizing it was Sir Knight returning. She expected to see her dinner, but instead the man brought in a beautiful young man with white hair, sleeping peacefully in his arms. The knight carried the young man in his arms, just like a princess. Sonidor grinned and was embarrassed by this picture, but did not answer the unsuspecting knight's questions. She sat down on the bed beside His Highness and looked at him closely. He was fabulously handsome, as if he had stepped out of the pages of a fantasy novel. White hair and eyelashes, equally fair skin, and a sturdy build. But Sonidor was concerned with another unresolved issue. She still hadn't been fed dinner, so she hurriedly asked the knight about it. He in turn snorted and replied that she should first treat His Highness, and only then would she get food. The girl made a pretty face and asked him not to push her, because she was already having a hard time. She already knew she couldn't do it quickly. It was just an excuse to start treatment as soon as possible, and not to argue. Still, even from such a stern knight, a caring gesture could be expected. He remembered the very cherry cake that the craftswoman had told him about in town, and brought it to her, which certainly pleased Sonidor. The girl pretended to be a naughty girl and threatened that the blame for her sudden awakening due to hunger would rest on the knight's shoulders. But the man was not to be fooled, and he ordered her to begin her work. The girl snorted, sensing her defeat, leisurely removed her glove and took the sleeping prince's strong hand, sinking into his dreams. In an instant, she began to fall into a dark place full of stars and unknown bodies, exactly like the cosmic sky. She had to find a way into the crown prince's subconscious. It seemed like a long way to go, but surprisingly, the portal to this unknown world, which no one had given her any information about, was right in front of her, as if luring her into its domain. Normally, when a person was cursed, their consciousness was hard to find, but His Highness's mind flickered like the brightest star. Sonidor entered the passage and found herself in a black and white world, as if the prince had been afflicted with achromasia. The world was completely devoid of bright colours. The trees seemed like one big mass of trees, and the sky loomed over the ground as if before a heavy downpour. Sonidor, moreover, could not move. When she looked down, she found that she had appeared in this world in the body of a white snake. It was quite creepy, because it usually turns into the one that the master of the mind favours the most. So Marmel has a thing for snakes. The only thing spooky was a strange song coming from somewhere in the distance. The air was full of disgusting odours, like old iron. Whether she had stumbled into the mind of Prince Charming and not a psychopath, she couldn't know. Sonidor crawled over to the pond and found an equally horrible picture there. The bottom was full of human skulls. Not wanting to find out where they came from, the girl rushed away. It was a real graveyard under the water. Sonidor tried to reassure herself with thoughts that they might just be harmless rocks, but it was hard to fool her eyes, even for such a professional of her craft. Running away from the creepy place, the girl came across something that was much more dangerous. She saw a huge dragon, whose head had already been cut off by an unknown creature. It couldn't have been a worse sight for the day. She was about to tuck her tail away when the same prince appeared in front of her, standing firmly on his feet, ready for a confrontation. He stared fearlessly at the monster, and then with a single swing of his sword, he slew the healthy dragon. Blood spattered his face, and while he was recovering his breath, a mad laugh escaped his lips. He must be crazy. Marmel faintly called out to his father, probably the emperor himself. Then his attention quickly turned to the small white snake. With a blank stare, the prince said that she was not from his paradise, so she should get out of here. With those words, a broad palm began to cover her, wishing for her demise. The girl awakened. When she raised her head, she found herself in the same room as before. except that the prince was lying on the bed, smiling faintly. He was definitely trying to kill her. What she saw could only help her forget the delicious treat. Sonidor was munching on her favorite cherry cake brought by the knight. She looked so sweet and innocent that she embarrassed the man. The knight covered his face with his hand, trying to distract himself, and asked how she felt after everything. Then the girl began to describe the amazing texture and taste of the pastry masterpiece, with notes of chocolate. She obviously misunderstood him. The knight interjected, clarifying that he meant the state of his highness. The girl looked at the prince sleeping peacefully on the bed and thought. Outwardly there was nothing wrong with him, but his inner world was rather frightening. Sonidor asked if the prince had been stressed lately, to which she received the knight's incredulous question about the meaning of the condition. Yes, he was a real breadcrumbs as far as feelings were concerned. Sonidor exhaled desperately and leaned back in her chair. When she asked how Terry was doing without her, the knight replied that he would have been informed in case of trouble. It was necessary to continue the treatment, but the girl was so exhausted that all she craved now was peace and rest. It would have been better to save her strength until tomorrow, but it turned out that a healer would arrive the next day to help her recover. The girl's face puckered with indignation, for she would now have to work herself to exhaustion. To brighten the atmosphere, the knight offered to bring her any more food she wished now. It was a mistake, because the girl immediately began to list a lot of delicious things that were impossible to remember the first time. He handed her a piece of paper and told her to write everything down. After enjoying her meal, Sonidor once again travelled to the mind of His Highness. This time she found herself in the palace she was in now, but it was still devoid of any colour. This time she also became a white snake with a floral pattern. It could only mean that the prince didn't miss anyone in his dream world at all. Crawling through the long, empty and silent corridors, Sonidor realised that at this rate, she might get used to this way of travelling. Finally, she arrived at a massive door. It was unlocked, and the girl had no difficulty in entering the spacious room, where Marmel's slender figure stood at the wide windows, gazing thoughtfully outward. His gaze fell again on the unfamiliar creature. He recognised her as the same flowered snake that had shamelessly invaded his paradise. He didn't remember creating her in his world. Sonidor didn't understand what paradise he was talking about, so the prince didn't realise that what was happening was just a dream. Maybe he wasn't cursed at all. The prince stood opposite the guest and looked down at her. He said he didn't mind her company and held out his hand to her. The snake immediately wrapped itself around his wrist and rose with his hand to face him, which now bore a soft smile. The prince thought she might be able to answer the question he had long wanted to ask. At that moment, a maid entered the room with a tray full of fruit in her hands, but her body was missing its head, just like the dragon's. The prince took the apple and brought it up to his face, asking the snake if he should eat it or not. Sonidor had an epiphany in an instant. This is the real source, in other words, a person or object that could give her some new information in her dream. Usually, they are hidden in the most secret corners of consciousness or dreams, and can act as clues, like pointers leading to the deepest depths of the inner world of the sleeper. The prince looked at his new girlfriend with a smile and waited for an answer. Why he wanted to get an answer to his question from her, Sonidor didn't know. And snakes can't talk, so it didn't make sense. And yet the craftswoman dared to answer. She asked if His Highness knew what would happen if he bit into an apple, and this action caused her only astonishment. She could really answer. Naturally, the prince heard her. His eyes stared at the snake in mute puzzlement. He had not expected a creature incapable of such a thing to answer him. The prince laughed, covering his face with his hand. He was so glad to hear human speech for such a long time, even from a snake, for in his paradise no one could talk. It was not surprising, for they had no heads. The prince immediately realised that perhaps his guest was not a snake at all. Sonidor did not know how to answer him. The sleeper should not know that what was happening was just a dream, and she should not be in his mind. Otherwise, the entities living in the world of the sleeper would immediately push her back into the real world. However, the prince already knew that what was happening was not real, and there were not so many entities around. There was only one headless maid. Sooner or later, these entities would find out that she was a stranger in this world. so Sonidor decided to take a chance and said that His Highness was right. She wasn't from his paradise, and she wasn't a snake at all. Marmel bombarded her with questions about her origins, her true identity, and how she had come to be here. The girl replied that she was none other than a dream maker named Sonidor. The prince realized that her abilities helped her penetrate other people's dreams. Apparently, she was hired by his father, the emperor. The girl confirmed that she was here to wake him from his eternal sleep. The prince said to be quiet, and noticed with a smile that a maid was already sharpening her knives on the snake. He explained that although she couldn't see without her head, she could hear perfectly well. Sonidor said she thought that since the prince, the dream master, knew so much, it would all go away, but that wasn't the case. The entities still wanted to finish her off. The prohibition was even in such circumstances. You can't wake her up. It's a taboo in the dream world. With an equally soft smile, the prince added that it was best not to say the word, for the malevolence of these creatures was no joke. The snake was touched that His Highness had just saved her. The moment was spoiled by the prince's dropped phrase. He wanted answers to all of his questions, so he wished the snake no imminent death. Sonidor was disappointed. The prince began to ask questions again. He was curious to know how long he had been wandering through the dream world, for fear of losing track of time. It was about 2 weeks, which was a long time. He needed to go back, but only the master could show him the way. Perhaps he would have to follow her. But it wasn't that simple. Things could change by eating the sauce, allowing them into the deeper layers of the subconscious. Sonidor was referring to the fruit brought by the maid. The prince didn't want to taste the fruit, for he might fall deeper into oblivion. He didn't know what they were, but his gut told him to eat them. The prince stared at his reflection in the peel of the grated apple in silence. Then the same sly smile reappeared on his face. He said that since the craftswoman wanted him to eat that apple, she should tempt him. He was expecting some kind of hypnotic snake dance in Sonidor's performances. The music was terrible, so that option was bad. But Marmel had mentioned myths in which snakes usually tempted people. He was expecting something eloquent from her. Sonidor said that since the depths of the prince's subconscious frightened him so much, she could become his companion and be there to help him overcome his difficulties in time. She tried to figure out what he was so afraid of, an uncertain future or a past that could not be changed. Either way, these pasts should be left behind, and that's why she was here, to help him. The prince could not trust her for nothing. There was only one way out, and that was to do it just like other people captivated by the tempter's sweet speeches. She could at least listen and give an answer if the prince had doubts and fears. The girl promised to take the prince's secrets to the grave, thinking that she would go there soon enough, but the boy said he didn't really believe her. But if he did, it would at least be less dreary. With a smile on his face, His Highness took a bite of the apple. The crunch of the fruit was followed by the words that it was time to wake up. They were clearly from the real world, so the girl woke up and found the unknown man looming over her. The stranger asked how she slept, to which Sonidor, out of habit, covered herself with a blanket and asked what was going on here. The man grinned and replied that he was the healer who was due to arrive today. His name was Hagit. He bowed, smiling just as slyly at the master. After a long sleep at work, the hands of the healer Hagit came at the right time with a therapeutic and relaxing massage. His movements spoke for themselves that he was a true professional, but the atmosphere of relaxation was spoiled by the stern gaze of the knight, looking at them from across the table. It looked as if they'd had an argument, but Hagit explained that he was just discussing some adult matters with Sir Christian. Christian said irritably that there was no time for this talk at all, and ordered to get to work immediately. Suddenly, Sonidor realized the reason why the prince had fallen into eternal oblivion. He had simply escaped to his own imaginary world, the so-called paradise, from reality. No other way, he was in transition, the kind of teenage rebellion that never leads to anything good. Now His Highness had escaped into the depths of sleep, not knowing how to get back to reality. Since Sonidor had already figured out the cause, she could now go to him again to get him out. Christian thought so, but the girl was exhausted both mentally and physically from being underground for so long. She wanted to enjoy the fresh air, at least a little. But in the knight's understanding, there was no point in wasting time, because the master had already slept for half a day, resting from her work. Well, this guy sometimes seems more formidable than the emperor himself. The girl decided to distract herself and ask how her partner Terry was doing. It turned out that he was doing well, but he was going crazy from the constant rest in bed, pretending to be asleep. It seemed that he would be happy to be in his mistress's place right now, but she could only envy him. It was time to dive back into the prince's subconscious. The knight wished good luck, and the girl thanked him, allowing him to finish her ginger cookies. Yes, try not to grumble so much, or else the gingerbread men would run away from such a formidable warrior. But Christian was not in the mood for jokes. Sonidor realized she should put these things aside and get to it. She touched the prince's hand again, just as she had before, but this time she couldn't feel his consciousness. It seemed as if it had evaporated. Then Sonidor asked permission to increase the contact zone with His Majesty. The request sounded very doubtful. The girl wanted to try to hug the prince, but got a judgmental look from the knight. She immediately clarified that she didn't think of anything bad or obscene. But Christian wasn't sure he had the right to authorize her to do such a thing. The girl exhaled and said that she was acting as a doctor now, and it was in her interest to do everything she could to help His Highness wake up. This time the case was serious, so the most powerful techniques would have to be used. Christian had no choice but to allow her this ridiculousness. Sonidor climbed onto the bed with the boy and glimpsed him. It was the first time she'd ever been able to see him so closely. She was mesmerized by his graceful features and sturdy build. But she couldn't allow herself to think those thoughts anymore, because even with such a beautiful guy, she had to behave like a doctor. The knight hurried the girl, and she pressed herself against the prince, sinking again into the depths of subconsciousness. This time everything worked, and through the bright star tunnel, she found herself in a familiar black and white world. Sonidor considered the gazebo in the middle of the garden, which neither smelled of floral fragrance nor gave off bright colours. There was no progress in this gloomy place, and she felt very strange. She was not in the form of a snake this time. Sonidor said aloud that the apple seemed to have no effect, but she was startled by a voice from below, denying her words and saying that this was no longer the same paradise as before. With fear, she plumped into the snow-white palms of her hands. Marmel looked at her fondly, noting that she was now in the form of a bird unable to fly. Marmel lightly touched the bird with his finger and asked why she always appeared before him in a new guise. She told him that it was not up to her, for everything suited His Majesty's preferences. The sight of her was so sweet and innocent that the prince expressed his desire to bite her, but the girl only mumbled irritably, realizing that she was not being listened to. She wondered how His Highness would recognize her, since she was always changing her appearance. The answer was simple. She had a head, unlike other creatures. She had always told him that she would be there for him, and that explained everything. The prince stood still for a moment and noticed that he felt much warmer after the appearance of the craftswoman, an unknown feeling of softness. With these words, Marmel moved his hands in the air as if trying to feel something. It was probably how he felt Sonidor's embrace in reality. The girl was embarrassed and took her small eyes aside, fluffing her feathers. The prince grew more and more amused and asked again if he could bite her. The girl resented and rejected the foolish request. It was important to her now to see if Marmel would recognize the place in which they had appeared. The prince replied that it was a palace of freesias. It was strange, however, to see a garden where the flowers were entirely absent. Marmel explained that the garden had been used by his late mother and was now idle and empty. Sonidor invited him to imagine the old garden, with all its scents, colours and vibrancy. After a little silence, the prince said he couldn't do that. Perhaps it was due to the fact that he was no longer in his paradise, but that wasn't the point at all. He just didn't remember everything from that period of his life very well. His mind was in complete chaos. In paradise he could control everything, but here he could hardly control the terrain. Everything seemed so soulless, so still. Then Sonidor realized that this time they were in a deeper layer of Marmel's subconscious, which was why her palm was not enough for contact, for the barrier had become stronger and more solid. The more the prince loses control, the more difficult it will be for her to invade his dreams. So Sonidor told Marmel that in order to return, he needed to look for sources. He would be unconsciously drawn to them, as if by a magnet, as had happened with the apple. The girl asked if he felt something similar here, but the answer was ambiguous. The girl, sitting down on the palm of the prince's hand, explained that it could be absolutely anything: a meaningful place, a thing, as well as some actions, beliefs, desires, love, or faith. Anything at all. She fluffed her feathers and firmly told Marmel not to worry, for he was in good hands. Almost everything she listed was connected to secret desires from the past, so nothing in the dream was accidental. Sonidor put a wing on the prince's finger and promised to help him. Suddenly, Marmel felt as if the living touch of a woman's warm hand coloured everything around him for a moment. After hesitating a bit, he asked if he could wake up. But that word was the second taboo. In fear, the bird shuddered and cried out that it could not say it. Out of desperation, it covered its eyes with its wings, preparing for trouble. But all that was heard outside was Marmel's laughter, repeating unceasingly how sweet she was. He said he didn't think his words would hurt her. Not yet, whatever that meant. If he said that word in his paradise, the headless servants would bring whatever things he liked: board games, sweets, and other things. It was as if they were trying to keep him in this world. But this time no one showed up, and all after he had eaten the sauce apple. Marmel concluded that if he continued to follow Sonidor, nothing good awaited him. The girl flapped her wings, denying it, but his words were only fears, and he hoped unfounded. Then the bird fluttered up and flew off to survey the surroundings. Surely there must have been a reason why the prince was in this particular garden this time. When she returned to Marmel's shoulder, she suggested looking for flowers that might be a new source. Besides, since it was a Frisia palace, he could try to recreate them himself. The prince doubted the idea, but everything had to be tried. Then he clenched his fist and put his mind into creating a plant. But the result was a wilted or withered ugly sprout. Anything but the right flower. The girl suggested trying other flowers. Marmel only remembered the ones that had to do with his horoscope. He exhaled and waved his palm in the air. In his hand appeared small flowers called thanatos, or otherwise the flowers of death. Sonidor opened her eyes, waking up in a sweat. Her face was still against the sleeping young man's, and there was silence all around. She seemed to have been pushed out of his dreams. After the hard work, the healer's massage was the only thing that saved her. The girl's body felt as if it were falling apart. She was already having a hard time, and now she wanted to leave everything and run away into the night. After the procedure, the craftswoman could barely stand up, contemplating everything that had happened. She realized that she still hadn't introduced herself to Hagit in return. Apologizing, Sonidor said her name, looking at the man in a friendly manner. The healer shook his head cordially, realizing that her name sounded like good night in the imperial language. What an interesting coincidence with her ability, a name that spoke volumes. He shook her hand happily. Sonidor thanked Hagit for his help, for when she first woke up, it was as if her body had not listened to her, but now she felt much better. The healer only rubbed his head with his hand and acknowledged that his hands were golden. Master noticed how informally the doctor was talking to her. He probably didn't know how old she was, to which Hagit said his rough guess, 23 or so. The girl froze, not realizing whether the man was telepathic or not, but the mute question was also satisfied. It was already written all over Sonidor's face. He sent her a kiss and said she could call him brother now. Now the man was annoying her more than ever. Like an energy vampire, he was sucking the strength out of her, which he'd barely gotten back after her hard work. The situation worsened when Sonidor heard the healer whispering her own name in her ear. The girl squealed, calling for the knight's help. The man just happened to be next to her behind the wall. She had complained to him about the healer's strange behaviour, and though he denied it, pretending it was because he was working and trying to be friends, the girl claimed he was lying. The strange nicknames made her shudder too. Christian tolerated their verbal altercation for a long time, until he was tired of waiting for it to end. He ordered them both to shut up and pointed out to Hagit how important the girl was to the Empire, which was why he should have treated her more respectfully and not pestered her. All the cards were in the knight's favour until the healer thought of a new way to stir up a fuss. He said that Christian was the perfect brother for the role of brother, a stern character and a physique like any girl's dream. The knight's patience had come to an end, and the healer received a slap on the wrist for such antics. Sonidor wondered how such a man could have become His Highness's personal physician. Surely the emperor wouldn't tolerate such antics, but he would rely on skill. But Christian explained that he had never behaved that way at court, though it was hard to believe in his current situation. Perhaps Hagit was just as desperate as the girl and was trying to take everything in life. There were guests in the chambers. Sonidor turned around and saw her favourite partner, Terry, accompanied by another warrior. The girl ran up to him and jumped into his arms. The boy spun her around in his arms and lowered her to the ground. But suddenly, Terry's face changed. He admitted that he had screwed up his assignment, which was putting it mildly. He had been given a chance to make things right, but the situation was beyond disgusting. Good thing the guy was still alive. The knight walked away, leaving the questions unanswered, and the matron began to interrogate her hapless partner about his blunder. What could be so complicated about a plan where all he had to do was lie flat in bed? The girl didn't understand. The guy admitted that his acting skills weren't that good, but he could lie there as if in a dream. The problem was something else entirely. At some point, a servant came to his chambers and, bowing humbly, announced that Lady Anderson had come to see him. Terry had not been expecting visitors, and this unexpected news made him break out of character. The Crown Prince was rather quiet, like a smouldering ash. The subjects were all praising the young man, predicting many years of rule, but most of the officials were not so welcoming. One of them thought that His Highness was pursuing a strategy of concession in the name of compromise. The man in the suit raised his glass of wine, musing about how the prince gave in easily and was the first to extend a hand of reconciliation with a smile. To some, it may seem a duplicitous act, perhaps a gesture of weak character, and to others a jewel without luster. At this rate, the weak-hearted heir may become a pawn in the hands of his own subordinates when he ascends the throne. The man decided that the prince simply needed a companion who could keep him on the right path. And that companion was Lady Isabella, a golden-haired lady of impeccable appearance. That day, this my lady, without heeding the entreaties of the servants, burst into His Highness's chambers when he needed rest. The lady swung open the doors, taking the fake prince by surprise. She threw herself on his chest, pressing her cheek against it. The knight who brought Terry had ordered the fake to just pretend to be sick and lie in bed, not talking to anyone so as not to stir up too much. The plan was simple. He needed to hold out until the next evening, when the acting coach would arrive. Only that plan didn't include the appearance of His Highness's fiancé. Of course, Terry panicked. Isabella asked if the prince resented her for coming unannounced, for she could not leave him alone in such a state. Terry tried to dismiss her by calling her my lady. This startled the girl, and she recoiled, saying that she realized at once how offended His Highness was to speak to her so dryly, and not even call her by her name, as she had done before. But Terry couldn't know how Marmel communicated with his fiancée, and he couldn't say too much, so as not to aggravate the situation. The silence only made the girl more frightened, and she took it for coldness. She realized that moping seemed to have taken its toll on the prince, preventing him from thinking as calmly as before. Isabella apologized for her haste. She needed to know if everything was all right, for Marmel's face did not look ill at all. She grasped the sleeve of the prince's shirt, but he yanked it away from her in fright. That was the last straw. The lady decided that today was simply not a good day for her visit, so she ran out of the prince's chambers in tears, saying she would pray for his health. Terry couldn't stop her. The lady passed the unknown man in confusion as he approached the chambers of the fake, who was already being told off by his knight. The warrior had said that such shenanigans would quickly expose their plan, and he would be skinned for breaking the prince and Lady Anderson's engagement. The unknown man smiled and interrupted the act of punishment, saying they would not allow it. The slender brunette introduced himself as Giuseppe. He had just arrived here on the Emperor's orders. It turned out that the acting mentor was standing right in front of them. He had arrived a day early and caught the timing of their need in the middle of it. Giuseppe also asked the knight not to shout about the fake prince to the entire palace, or they would indeed be declassified. The man promised to speak to Lady Anderson and straighten out the situation. Terry was overjoyed, and he shook his saviour's hand, not knowing how to thank him. Unless, as the grief-stricken tutor had suggested, he should thank him in kind. That was the end of the mess that had left Terry standing before his mistress. The two of them had each gotten a weirdo with less than the best of intentions in their minds. Sidor was glad her partner was at least in one piece, and she needed to get back to work. Terry was already pleased with the comfortable chairs his mistress had been given, but the fact that the girl had gone straight to the prince's box puzzled him. Sidor explained that His Highness's consciousness was not easy to capture, so it was a forced measure. Hagit said not to disturb the adults and held Terry back, saying he could play with his brother, and the girl snuggled up to the prince and fell back into sleep. The girl found herself in a garden full of colours and flowers. The scents filled the air, and everything around her no longer looked so lifeless and dull. As long as there was a difference, so was progress. Her musings were interrupted by the prince's arms encircling her from behind. Sidor was in the guise of a fox this time, just the right colour for her gorgeous and slightly unruly hair. Marmel took the vixen in his arms and said he was waiting for her here. But Sidor pushed away from the prince's sturdy figure with her paws and stepped away. She still remembered how he had pushed her out of my dreams. Marmel asked for at least a hug, but the girl firmly refused. She told His Highness that when something like this happened, she felt a terrible, tearing pain inside. The prince looked regretfully at the master and began to approach. The girl ordered him not to approach, threatening to run away, and turned her face away from him resentfully. He admitted that it had been an accident, and he hadn't meant to send her away. The girl had asked about the prince's wish the last time, and he'd gone mad. His gaze went blank, and he grabbed the unfortunate bird, squeezing it in his hand, wondering if it was afraid to ask such questions after all it had seen here. A shredded dragon, decapitated creatures, and other horrors. Sidor gasped and cried out that he could not escape his oblivion with rage alone. The flames of anger are bright, but they go out quickly, leaving only destruction and emptiness. But even these ashes can serve as soil for sprouts, dormant as buds. But they will need support to grow quickly, and that support may be the people around the prince. Marmel asked who could be this support for him here, if there was not a soul to listen to him and understand him. The girl pointed to herself again. Foxy remembered this dialogue with bitterness, and did not understand how he could do this to her, when she addressed the prince with all her soul. Then she said that Marmel was rather strange, for then he had evidently felt a sudden desire to drive her away, and now for some reason he was pretending to be glad to see her again. The prince says that's not true. He just loves animals, creatures who never need anything from him. They can listen and say nothing in return. If one were to stick to this judgment, Sidor says a lot, but that was not the point. The prince was simply afraid of the new bonds he might lose again, because of the death of his newfound friend. The girl noticed the guy's reaction to her words, and continued. She understood that he was afraid of losing someone or something precious to him again, and she was right. It was clear at the mere sight of the headless creatures, and if you add in the problems with his father, you get the full psychological picture. Sidor asked what he would do if she stopped coming to him. The boy, thinking, answered that in that case he would be a prisoner in his world forever, but that was not the question at all. Then Marmel crouched on his knee, reaching out to the vixen, begging her not to leave. Sidor's heart nearly jumped out of her chest. Marmel said that he did his best to keep everything dear to him safe. Since he was a child, he had memories of his father executing one by one the people the prince had asked for clemency. But in return for all the tearful pleas and tantrums, he received a neatly packaged box with the severed head of an innocent man. The boy took hold of his head, torturing himself with horrible memories. He confessed that he had only one solution: to kill his father and take the throne from him. Only then would this nightmare stop. But the vixen stopped his monologue about his bloody past and its consequences. She rested her paws on the prince's chest and looked directly into his eyes, asking if His Highness didn't realize that this wasn't the way out. The craftswoman suggested another option. Instead of final closure in himself and prolonged self-destruction, it is better to start fighting for everything he holds dear, putting his life on the line without regrets. The prince noticed with a smile that the girl was once again demanding something impossibly difficult from him. And then she felt the prince's lips on her wet nose, kissing it gently. It was a clever ruse to distract the girl's attention, so the vixen was caught back in the arms of the prince. The colours came back completely after the vixen was in the prince's arms, and the boy only kept saying how adorable the furry creature was. In embarrassment, she began to paw at him, shoving Marmel's face away from her. The prince even offered to let her live here with him, but she refused. We had to get the stubborn guy back to the real world first, and then he could have as many foxes as he wanted. But Marmel objected that one was enough for him. She asked him if she thought this was the prince's consent to their rapprochement. The answer was evidently positive. Sonidor figured he might not have responded that way if she had been in a different guise. However, the prince didn't care, but the next time he suggested that she appear as a bunny. By the way, she's human, so the mastermind was very indignant about it. The prince grinned and said that if he liked someone, no amount of makeup would change that, to which he received another peck on the cheek. The vixen jumped from Marmel's arms, and he asked how she was going to get close to him if she kept running away from him. But she had no choice. His Highness probably didn't realize that the person in front of him was just like him. He really didn't feel it. The girl also specified her gender, and the boy only nodded, sitting down in front of her and beckoning her with his finger. Sonidor ventured closer and immediately received a pleasant scratching. It was much more pleasant than she thought it would be. This kind of animal interaction therapy was very useful, but only if the girl kept quiet. Marmel questioned the girl about her abilities, as well as her name. She had forgotten whether she had introduced herself or not. Then Sonidor said her name. It seemed familiar to the prince. He realized that it must have a special meaning, and Marmel was the first to recognize it. After taking over the island, the inhabitants of Descensia were forbidden to speak and spread their native language. In this way, the Imperials gained full control over their newly founded colony, taking away what united its inhabitants. Simply put, a simple and effective way. In 500 years, the language has become forgotten, dead. The only thing left of it were the names of the islanders. Most of the inhabitants of the empire knew nothing about the language, and they had no interest in learning it. But when Crown Prince Ark mentioned the hidden meaning of the name Sonidor, she felt strange. The girl translated her name as a dream filled with precious shards of reality. Marmel thought the transcript was rather long, but with a soft smile on his face, he said it suited her and scratched the vixen behind the ear. Suddenly, a palace appeared behind His Highness. The prince admitted that he hadn't created it, which meant it could be a new source. Since it appeared, the conditions were met. The pair decided to look closer. The corridors of the castle didn't look so ominous anymore, more like real chambers, but the headless servants were still creepy, and there were more of them here. The vixen trembled, realizing that she was in great danger here, and then the prince offered to take her in his arms, to which the girl readily agreed, whimpering in Marmel's ear. The prince moved deeper into the palace, and Sonidor caught sight of two familiar figures near the central staircase. When she looked more closely, she found that it was the young prince and the young emperor. The prince asked if that was the effect of the source, but the girl only shrugged and said that it probably was, but it seemed to embody bits of the prince's memories here. Apparently that's why she and the emperor have heads. What the prince saw was only a replay of a picture from the past. The master asked him to remember when it had happened, but Marmel did not know what to answer. His memories were very fragmentary and hazy, and if he tried to concentrate, everything began to swim in his head. Then the prince and the vixen made the decision to just watch. The emperor told the young prince that he remembered his son's words of trust, but the prince kept silent. Then the emperor went on to say that if it was true, then Marmel should prove it. Sonidor didn't realize what was about to happen and was terrified, expecting anything but the next thing. The little prince suddenly fell down the stairs, trusting in the fall to his father, who should have caught him, but the emperor's response was only to step aside and let the prince collapse to the floor. This was the emperor's response to his son's trust. He thought his naivety was foolishness, so he decided to teach such a cruel life lesson. Moaning in pain, the young prince raised himself to all fours. His head ached from the impact of the fall, and scarlet blood dripped from the back of his head. The emperor told his son to remember this pain and not to show his weakness in front of anyone. That was the price of trust. Memories began to resurface in His Highness's mind after watching this scene from his distant childhood. It was as if the world was falling apart and losing its colours again. Vixen tried to shout to Marmel, but all she got in response was the same cold stare, and then she was pushed out of his dreams again. The girl woke up in sweat in the same position as she was sinking into the prince's mind. It was so unfair. Only His Highness began to open up to her, and the colours returned to his world, as something went wrong again. Her sadness was interrupted by the voice of the Emperor himself, who came to check on the progress of the treatment and caught the whole picture. He demanded an explanation from the craftswoman. Now she would have to explain again that it was part of the treatment process. Sonidor lowered her eyes bashfully to the floor and tried to justify herself, saying that it was not at all what the Emperor had in mind. He replied that he was mindful of his permission to use any method he wanted, but a tight embrace in bed was too much. There was no other way, and contrary to the belief that a craftswoman needed only the palm of her hand to work, she said His Highness's consciousness was deeper than she could have imagined. The Emperor only said that Marmel was weak, not realizing that the whole problem lay in his father's disgusting upbringing. Stubbing out his cigar, His Majesty said that he let the master relax, and therefore decided to give her a deadline for her work. Sonidor, trying to keep a smile on her face, said it had only been a few days, but the Emperor wouldn't even listen to her. He gave her 2 weeks to finish her work. It was extremely short, but His Majesty felt that with such close contact, it was enough time. If it failed, Sonidor would be executed. The girl recoiled in fear from the Emperor. The master disputed this, saying that she would probably die anyway, but His Majesty reminded her of his promise, so there was no reason to doubt him. But the girl could not believe him after what she had seen in the prince's deep memories. She reminded him of the incident when he had sneakily deceived his son, when he had trusted him and ended up falling down the stairs. The lesson had been learned successfully, not to trust even your own father. The Emperor scratched his beard. He was impressed that the craftswoman had even gotten to such small details that only he and Marmel could know about. But in any case, the Emperor said he would make a decision after seeing the results, and then waved his finger at Christian. The knight obediently held out his palm, against which His Highness, without thinking long, put out his cigar. It seemed that this pain was felt not only by the servant himself, but also by all the witnesses of this atrocity. It turns out that the rumours that the Knights of Rysel are the Emperor's personal dogs were confirmed. Suddenly, His Majesty remembered the master's question about the prince's preferences. He remembered that he liked snow. Perhaps that might make the task easier. The Emperor left the company, and the girl didn't know whether to believe him after all that had happened. But there were other things to think about right now. Terry and Sonidor immediately rushed to the knight, asking him how he was feeling. He dismissed it as nothing, but the pair were restless. They immediately ordered the warrior to show them his arm to give them treatment. After everything that had happened, Sonidor was exhausted, and only Cherry Cake could brighten her grey days. She had so many disappointments to deal with in a few days, and the time frame was so short. There was not much time, so the girl hurried to finish the treat. There was little choice, either to wake the prince or to eat all the sweets in the palace. Sonidor enthusiastically wrote the knight a list for her bottomless stomach. In the meantime, she thought about the father's unfair treatment of his son. You can't treat a little child so carelessly. She didn't even know what she could say to Marmel now, for it appeared that he had erased his own painful memories to get rid of the pain. Sonidor was determined. When she finished writing the list, she went back to bed with the prince, not wanting to leave him alone in a dim and lifeless world. Only Sonidor covered her eyes as she realized she couldn't feel Marmel's consciousness again. Probably because of the traumatic events that had surfaced, his mind had gone even deeper. She would have to act again. The girl raised herself from the bed and asked the trio accompanying her to allow her to unbutton His Highness's shirt. Terry dropped his chair in surprise, and the others were silent in amazement. The girl explained everything, calming the men down, and got down to business. She was in a hurry, so it was a mess again. But after exposing the prince's chest, Sonidor once again couldn't resist taking a closer look at him. This time the wizard still managed to sink into the prince's mind. She found herself in the middle of a snow-covered garden. The branches of the trees and the ground were white and crisp under her paws. This time the girl was in the form of a white and fluffy dog. She realized it by giving her voice. The only thing left to do was to find the prince, who should be nearby. Sonidor spotted Marmel among the snow-covered bushes, their green leaves still warm from the cold. She barked at him and knocked him down, licking his face like a real dog. The prince was overjoyed to have her back, and didn't mind the attention at all. He had been looking forward to his fox, but the new furry wonder was just as good. Marmel hugged his friend and nuzzled his nose into her thick fur. Sonodor asked if the prince was upset by the change of appearance, but he was glad. Her newfound warmth warmed him more than ever. After the guide had disappeared the last time, he had found himself outside the palace and had begun to freeze from the sudden snowfall on the occasion of the onset of winter. But he felt the warmth that appeared when Sonodor appeared again and began to look for her. The girl wondered where His Highness felt the warmth. It was probably his back. She admitted that it was all the fault of her hug in the real world. Turning her muzzle away, the craftswoman began to justify that it was just part of the treatment. But Marmel, kissing the fluffy ear of the little dog, said that there was no shame in it, for he was also hugging her now. The girl tried to explain that two people hugging in bed was nothing compared to what was happening now. But the prince did not listen to her, praising her nose and beady eyes. To him, she was sweet in every way, so it could be assumed that His Highness had given his consent to such an embrace. The couple decided to go inside the castle. Sonodor asked the prince on the way out if he had any happy memories associated with snow. Such an unexpected winter must surely have a reason. The prince replied that his memories were all jumbled up. After thinking for a while, he turned his head to the side and said that he couldn't remember even small things. In that case, the only thing left to do was to search. The dog deftly picked up the trail of lost memories. Her instincts led the pair to a massive door, behind which was the palace kitchen, filled with the aromas of baked goods, desserts, and fresh drinks. Sonodor suggested something sweet and cocoa, because the atmosphere outside the window was whispering to get warm and cozy. Something would come to mind. Marmel lightly flicked his finger on the spout of the master, saying that he wasn't 5 years old enough to drink such childish beverages. This offended the girl, and she pointed out that she was actually older than the prince by a full 3 years, which was not at all noticeable to him. But it didn't matter to her. The sweet smells beckoned Sonodor to the festive treats, and she, resting her paws on the table and wagging her tail, gazed at the sweet treats with a twinkle in her eyes. Marmel remembered the special pink macaroons, and they tasted and smelled accordingly. They were only served at the palace, but as an exception, he could treat his sweet friend to one. The girl drooled at the thought of the treat. She called the prince master in a huff, which only made him more excited. He stroked and petted the dog's cheeks, saying that she was probably just a sweet tooth who had sneaked him into the kitchen to steal something tasty. He said he would order the servants to serve macaroons. The entities were obeying him so far, which was good. It turned out that if you didn't piss them off, they were kind enough to do what he asked. The prince suggested that we admire the snowfall and then sit down at the table. But suddenly he was overcome by a terrible headache. The young man didn't have time to speak and held his head, ordering the voice inside to shut up. Sonodor began to call out to the prince, trying to distract him from this headache. The girl moved closer to him, rubbing her paw against his elbow. Marmel replied hoarsely that he could hear a voice calling him Melem. He said they were children, and it was snowing outside the window. She thought the prince was hallucinating, but suddenly the room changed. 2 children ran down the corridor before their eyes, laughing and beckoning Mel to follow them. The boy and the girl argued among themselves about how best to address him, since he is, after all, the crown prince. But there is no division of status between friends, it was obvious to the boy. At the moment, they were called out by a young Marmel, who ran out to meet the boys and asked what it was they wanted to show him. He looked much younger than in his earlier memories. The boys said they had found a kitten that had been left without parents. The boy brought it, and the girl resented that now all the care for it fell on her shoulders. The boy, trying to prove his involvement, started pinching the girl's cheeks. The prince asked the boys not to quarrel and to tell where the kitten was. He must be put in a warm place quickly, because he could freeze quickly outside. The boys calmed him down by saying that he was now in the stable. The joyful prince ran there. It turned out to be that happy memory associated with snow. He had loved animals since he was a child, and he looked very happy now. But she remembered that the emperor had spoken of his son's lack of any friendship. But these two looked like his friends, even though they were not aristocrats. So it must be His Majesty's doing. Marmel, meanwhile, hurriedly left the scene of the action, and the girl only had time to catch up with him, shouting in his wake to wait for her. The only disadvantage of her appearance was her slowness, but Sonidor flatly refused to travel in the arms of His Highness. The craftswoman irritably repeated that she was human, and the prince still couldn't realize it, thinking her to be a stuffed animal. The one said with a smile that he couldn't just imagine her in a different form, so much so he was used to her. The girl tried to describe herself, saying she looked like a fox with the colour of her permanently curly, unruly and long hair, and her eyes were green. Marmel asked her wryly if she was short. The craftswoman was offended and began to resent that she was not short at all, but that she was quite tall. With a smile, the prince asked if she was taller than he was, while creating a flower arrangement in his hands. Sonidor wasn't enough for Terry, and now His Highness was making fun of her. Naturally, she was shorter than the prince, but her outrage was suddenly interrupted by the flower collar that suddenly appeared around her neck. The girl said with tears of despair that it was the truest blow to her pride. This funeral wreath was worse than an ordinary collar, but the prince was all right with it. Then Sonidor asked why it was a wreath. The prince replied that his mother had taught him how to weave them long ago. There it was, another happy and romantic memory, but Marmel didn't think so. Another memory appeared before the couple. This time, the young prince was looking out the window with his late mother, delighting in the white first snow. It could have been a source, a treasured moment from life, but it was all wrong. The prince seemed to look happy here as well. But for some reason, he didn't consider these moments valuable, passing them by indifferently. Well, at least the space was no longer being destroyed, which meant there would be more memories available. Perhaps that flash of headache was caused by the formation of new images, but for the prince, they were just annoying shards of memory. To the girl's suggestion that he at least look at it all, Marmel replied that it was pointless. Suddenly, the picture changed again, and the couple found themselves in a new memory. Now they were in the living room, watching the young prince reading books with boredom. There was nothing special here either, except for the very macaroons on the table. The young prince let go of the maid and closed the book. He seemed much more serious this time, although his age hadn't changed. Something important might have happened in that time. He was also more unhappy here, and where that bright boy had gone was unclear. Marmel turned around again and headed away, saying that this memory had no value either. He certainly wouldn't forget what was important. These events may have once been valuable, but he didn't want to remember it now. He spoke of all the memories he had encountered along the way. But in this case, the young prince began to cough violently, covering his mouth with his hand. Blood began to drip from his mouth. The baby began to choke and cough up blood, writhing in pain. The little dog ran up, not realizing what was happening. It looked like there was poison in the tea. Then the girl asked His Highness to explain himself, but Marmel calmly looked through the book beside him, as if nothing was happening. He answered only that he had drunk poison in his youth, which was nothing special. But it was horrible. The prince explained that the poison had a short-term effect, so there would be no consequences. It was a common practice to take the poison in small doses to build up a tolerance to it. The boy was obviously in pain, but that was because it was harder for a young body to adapt to poison. The boy was clearly in pain, but that was because it was harder for young people to adapt to poison. Sonidor was increasingly amazed at how poisoning a child could be considered normal. After all, we are all still human, not excluding the prince, so bullying should not be considered normal. The boy coughed, sat down at his desk, and continued studying as if nothing had happened. No one even bothered to come and watch him. Marmel explained that that day he had probably forgotten to drink the poison before going to bed, as he was supposed to, so this time his father had given him a punitive dose. The girl looked at the prince in confusion. He was only too glad to meet her gaze at last. It was as if Sonidor hadn't been looking at him before, but at a stranger. The vision disappeared, and Marmel moved on. It was obvious that he had become so cold and indifferent because of the regular abuse. What had happened to him was not a bad outcome. He could have ended his life on his own. Marmel returned to the table full of sweets. The macaroons with roses were on the table, beckoning Sonidor, who was drooling all over the table. The prince picked up the plate and said with a smile that dogs can't have sweets. With sadness, The girl said that she was not a real dog, although she looked very believable. She tried to pull out the treat, but it was all in vain. Sonidor frowned and wondered what else she could do to get the treat. Then the prince asked her to lick his cheek, which the girl gladly did. She began to lick his face, falling on the sofa so diligently that she was even carried away by the instinctive process. She happily ate her well-deserved treat under the prince's thoughtful gaze. Marmel said that he remembered the happy moment in the snow that the girl had asked him about. He had it now. Marmel covered his eyes and gently kissed the dog's wet nose. Sonidor stared at his warm gaze and gentle smile and lost track of time. But her thoughts were interrupted by a new transformation of the subconscious world. Everything began to change rapidly, so loudly and chaotically that the prince instinctively protected his girlfriend by covering himself. The windows lit up red, and everything around them became even more saturated with color. The source was found along with the dog's missing flower collar. It turned out that both current and future memories counted. Sonidor underestimated the prince's love for animals, since they so cleverly change his consciousness, as for example, last time fox fur helped him wake up. A true animal lover. It was possible that the new world was similar to the past, as if it were a fragment of one system called memory. When the travelers destroy one fragment, they move on to another, approaching the innermost. The further you go, the darker and darker it gets. It would not be safe for even the prince himself to be there. Sonidor warned His Highness that the entities of the next world might be more dangerous. Since they had gotten close to his memory core, the creatures would try their best to keep him from leaving this place. Sonidor asked His Highness to listen to her carefully. Her time was running out. Her body was exhausted in the real world, so she would not be able to return for a while. The master therefore insisted that as long as the prince was alone, he would have to hide from entities and avoid dangerous situations. In response, a sword appeared in Marmel's hand. The guy didn't like the idea of hiding like a cowardly rat, but the entities were invulnerable, and they also excelled in numbers. He didn't like hiding like a cowardly rat, but the entities were invulnerable, and they were also outnumbered. The prince coldly retorted that nothing worse than death would happen, but that such an end was not in the master's plans at all. Sonidor explained that if he died in his sleep, the prince would be carried to places even deeper than the abyss, from which there was no escape. It will be a true sleep paralysis, bringing eternal pain and suffering. And the worst part is that the prince will never see the cute animals again. It seemed to work. The prince began to think about what else he would like to see in his lifetime. A harp seal, a giraffe, and a rhinoceros appeared on the list. The girl gave a final shout, disappearing gradually from Marmel's dream, for him to heed her words and not to get involved in battles under any circumstances. The prince scratched the dog by the ear and said that he must see the girl who looked like a fox. And then the craftswoman disappeared, leaving her next appearance a mystery to him. Sonidor awoke with a gasp and, barely crawling out of bed, began calling in a hoarse voice to Terry and Hagit. Her condition was extremely fatigued. The healer, helping the girl to regain consciousness, began to reprimand her for neglecting rest. He said that magic was not a cure-all, but that fatigue continued to accumulate in her body, and so rapidly that it wouldn't take long to drive her to the grave. The girl was only worried about one thing, whether the prince could do it alone. When she had recovered, she decided to go to him again. Hagit was against the idea, but it was useless to dissuade her. Sonidor sank back into the prince's memories. It was too early to rejoice, even with the intended progress. The 2-week deadline was slowly expiring. Now she had only 10 days at her disposal. She found herself back in the palace. Everything looked as natural and harmonious as before. The prince was definitely all right, if she could get a glimpse of his mind. From behind the door came the sound of quick footsteps that turned to running. It was unlikely that the prince would be running toward her so fast. Then it must be someone else. The doors swung open, and on the threshold appeared the figure of a menacing headless maid, running with a knife at the little beast in whose guise the master appeared. The situation was catastrophically dangerous. The girl ran, afraid to turn around, and searched for cover until she saw a gap in the wall where she could hide. There was no time to think about what she had become this time. She was lucky to be so nimble this time, but even though she was in the body of a rodent, she didn't realize that her backside would be much bigger than her head. The girl ended up stuck in the crevice, unable to get out on her own. This is the end, she thought, until an unknown hand pulled her out. Sonidor squealed, not wanting to leave with nothing, and bit her abuser's finger painfully. But her rescuer was the prince, who said he was in pain. The girl slowly unclenched her jaws, and Marmel was glad he wasn't dead. It was the first time he had ever seen a meerkat so close. Sonidor squealed at the sight of blood on her saviour's cheek. She begged for the blood to go away, covering her eyes with her paws. The prince wiped his face with his palm indifferently. He added that he had not disobeyed his guide, and as she had asked, he had hidden and killed no one until she came. Only this time he allowed himself to cut the essence with his sword to protect his animal. Sonidor knew full well that the prince had a dark side. Even the first meeting with him had shown what he was capable of, and it was only confirmed by the fact that the girl had seen from his shoulder the mountain of dead creatures left behind. It was amazing to the mastermind that he had been so diligent in holding back for so long that even she had managed to forget about it. After interrupting all the creatures, the prince wiped his cheek with his hand and wondered what was next. The girl couldn't bear the sight of blood, and stammering, said to just go ahead, listening to her senses. The prince should be drawn to the source as well. The more hidden it was, the better, for it was where his most private and intimate thoughts were stored. By that logic, they should have acted erratically, just like in the dream they were both stuck in. Then Marmel swung his sword at the wall, scratching it and making a nasty sound, trying to draw the creatures to him. If he killed them all at once, he would save himself a lot of trouble. The girl shouted that it was reckless, for they might come here in droves. She had warned the prince that there could be countless creatures. But immediately the masteress regretted what she had said. Marmel looked at her with a cold stare, taking her hand in front of her. She began to make excuses, but she could not string two words together, stammering in fear of being killed. Marmel said that all his actions were deliberate and out of the question. He embarrassed her again with his serene, angelic face, which hid his cruelty. He was so sweet to see the helpless animal about to cry. He confessed that he would like to see her tears, confident in the cuteness of the picture. Marmel added that the girl also has nothing to worry about, and he will do as she asks him. The conclusion was self-evident. The prince would only be nice to animals. It was obvious, and it wasn't clear what she was hoping for. She was afraid to imagine what he would do to her when he found her in human form, in bed with him in his arms. She feared for her only life. The girl tearfully asked for the blood to be removed from her clothes, unable to stand the sight of it, to which the prince remarked how many complaints his assistant was receiving today. Marmel knew of only one secluded place where personal memories could be stored. Approaching the wide door, the prince swung the doors open. In front of the pair was the emperor's private office, where a painful memory was already being played back. The sight of his father would make the prince feel worse, so the girl doubted the idea. She didn't even notice the little prince standing right in front of her father. The boy was trying to find out from his father, who was already reprimanding him for his pointless visit to the study, where the brother and sister of the Horn family were. The emperor was indignant that he had come to ask him where the servants were. I think the little prince was talking about the two kids who called him to look at the kitten. The emperor must have done something to those children since they were missing, and he was answering his son's questions so pointedly. The mistress asked His Highness why they were here, to which the prince said it was necessary to go through a shortcut to an underground passage. He pulled on one of the books, and immediately a secret door opened in front of his face. The prince had broken the spell manually. It turns out he is also capable of controlling mana. Meanwhile, the emperor continued to reprimand his young son for disobedience and ordered one of the knights to escort him out of the study. The prince shouted that they were only innocent children. His father told him that it was not a crime to be a child, but ignorance could get you in trouble. It was filigree logic. That's why they were ignorant, because they were small. The little prince was desperate to protect what was dear to him. The door closed. Sonidor could not understand only one thing: why the emperor was pushing his son so hard. Marmel moved along the stone corridor, lit by sparse fire torches, while the master continued to reason. Throughout their time together, the prince has treated her humanely, resembling his little self from the past. He has a good heart at the core of his character, except that madness has already taken root in him. He wanted to kill the emperor and take the throne from him to end this madness. It was all his father's fault. The only thing left to wonder was whether madness or humanity would prevail. Sonidor tried to make conversation, but the boy put a finger to his lips, signaling that he should be quieter now. He looked toward the end of the corridor, where the headless knight Rysel had suddenly emerged from. Now the task was much more difficult than with ordinary servants, for such a warrior was the equivalent of an army. The creature immediately charged at the prince, drawing its sword menacingly. Marmel shoved the animal into his shirt and ran away. If the emperor had seen her in such a position, he would have skinned her immediately and left her with a wet spot. First running away from a maid, and now a knight. Sonidor complained to herself about the choice of her appearance. She would have been better off as a cheetah. Meanwhile, the prince turned the corner, sword in hand. Without answering Sonidor's questions, Marmel lunged towards the knight and faced him with his sword, which emitted a piercing clang from the heavy blow. The prince was determined to fight. The shaking in Sonidor's chest was starting to make her feel dizzy, but she continued to watch the prince fight desperately against Knight Rysel. The forces were clearly unequal, but they still went at it. Marmel found himself huddled against the wall. Sonidor couldn't afford to stop believing in the heir and the empire, and she wasn't wrong. Dodging the headless knight's sword, the prince ran behind him, and his attacker's weapon was stuck in the wall. As he fled, Marmel snatched the glowing stone from the knight's cloak and fled, leaving the monster in the dungeon. After a while, they disappeared into one of the palace rooms. The girl jumped to the floor, happy either to feel the ground beneath her feet or to have saved her life. Tears of joy rolled down Sonidor's cheeks as she rubbed her cheek against the carpet of the room. The prince, even in his ragged and out-of-breath state, managed to notice the grace of his companion. He clung to his injured wrist, clutching the very piece of jewelry from the knight's armor in his teeth. In response to the concerned girl's questions, Marmel replied that he had only dislocated his arm. It happens when there is a big difference in weight class between you and your opponent. The prince was pleased that the girl was worried about him. Sonidor, on the other hand, said that it was very serious, because if she got injured, she would just wake up, but in the case of a sleeper, it would be quite different. Marmel snorted, and adjusting his shirt, said that in his paradise it was solved more easily. Obviously, his powers were fading. And now, after a couple of earthquakes, all he could do was turn on the lights in the room with a flick, which he did. The masteress looked around the gold-trimmed room, which was now fully illuminated. It was the very room where she was now treating His Highness. The prince grabbed the beast and placed it on his shoulder, and Sonidor continued to speculate that the state of this place must be maintained by magic, since there was no change in it. That was the answer. So the brooch the prince had stolen from the knight was familiar to her. It was the same one on Christian's clothes, the artifact for the tunnel. The prince flopped down on the bed with Sonidor out of exhaustion. The beast came out from under Marmel's palm and asked if it was because of this artifact that he had risked his life. His Highness confirmed the master's guess, adding that it would have been much more difficult if that knight had started sorcery. But the knight couldn't cast the spell because he was headless, which was what the craftswoman had noticed. The prince was reckless again, but he justified himself by saying that he wanted to check something. He looked at the brooch again and said that all such jewellery has the family crest carved on it, but it was not on the stone he had swiped. Besides, Marmel could only remember one knight who was left-handed. He whispered that the man's hand was still firm, calling the creature uncle. The girl raised her head, looking questioningly at the prince. She remembered that at the very beginning of her work, the emperor had given her a scroll that contained information about the prince. She scrutinized the miserable piece of paper. To think, one page about a living person, that's not much. Sonidor had a strong feeling at that moment that she had been tricked. It had only general information. Heir to the empire, Prince Marmel Ricarian K. Arca, 19 years old, of legal age as of this year. At 1 year old, he learned to speak, and at 3 he managed to master writing. Since the age of 4, he's been studying management and the history of the empire. In short, the bare facts and nothing personal. At 13, he was declared Crown Prince, and at 15, he was betrothed to the daughter of the ducal Anderson family. You could say he grew up following a script. The girl smirked and said that there was nothing to grab hold of, but suddenly an interesting line caught her eye. She slammed the scroll on the table and jumped up, frantically moving her finger over the letters. execution after execution. It was far from just the nanny the emperor had mentioned in passing. There were no survivors among those who had any connection to His Highness. Sonidor covered her mouth with her hand in horror, hooking her fingers on the table. A knight of Marmel Arche, before the prince was officially heir, had been his father's substitute. His name was Shan Alejandro, and he was His Highness's maternal uncle. He seemed to be a strong support for the prince for years to come. But even he was beheaded for treason, along with Empress Orduke herself. Oddly enough, it was this ill-fated day that was also chosen as the time for the initiation ceremony for the princes. Thus, the execution took place in front of Marmel's eyes by the decision of the now ruling Emperor Cardin. The prince pressed his late uncle's brooch to his chest, as if remembering that terrible moment. It turned out that the creature Marmel had fought with a few minutes ago was his real uncle. The situation was awkward, and the girl wondered how to get out of it. The prince tossed the brooch on the floor like a cheap piece of jewellery. Sonidor asked, puzzled, if he would throw it away now, to which he replied that he had learned everything he wanted to know, so the jewellery was no longer needed. Marmel leaned back on the gilded bed and exhaled. He wondered tiredly where the next shard of memories might be. His head was already pounding from the moments of the past connected to this place, and they were all jumbled together. Sonidor replied that at any rate, if it was something important, it would appear sooner or later. It should be forming by now. There was only a little more time to wait. Some sounds came from outside. Marmel turned with the master to the newly formed memory. A girl of marvellous beauty appeared before their eyes, as if she were a doll rather than a living person. She addressed the little prince, calling him Mel. The arrival asked to be understood correctly, for he was supposedly just passing through. Sonidor exhaled. She had already thought the girl was addressing them directly. Belle giggled, trying to get an honest answer out of the little prince, and asked so-and-so to tell him that he missed her, which she would be very happy about. In response, the prince flushed and agreed. It dawned on Sonidor. This was His Highness's first true love. She was embarrassed to see the young ones nuzzling each other when she heard Marmel's displeasure behind her. The prince seemed ashamed and wanted Sonidor to either somehow let the memory pass or remove it, but she replied that there was little choice. Either they watched or they left the room. Reluctantly, he covered his head with his hand. Sonidor didn't even know if she could continue to watch this awkward scene. Meanwhile, the girl grabbed Mel's hand and led her somewhere. Obviously a very brave girl, thinking it was just the two of them. The beauty then confessed that when she's with the prince, she always gets anxious thinking about the future without him, having no idea how she'll be able to cope, or what will happen if the emperor finds out. Mel grabbed the girl's hand, addressing her as Gabby. He said that as soon as he got the title of prince, he swore he would get his father's blessing, and they would be together. And then Gabby would no longer have to wait for him sneaking around in that room. He gave his word and asked her to be patient for a while until he had the power to protect her, because they couldn't rely on her mother and Uncle Mel for help forever. He added that he himself should be able to protect their love, and handed the girl a pendant with a small red heart, which she clutched to her chest with a smile. That was the end of the memory. The awkwardness in the room grew to a fever pitch. However, the prince was quite romantic for a 13-year-old boy. Sonidor looked closer, noticing something left over from a shard of memories on the floor. If she understood correctly, even that sweet girl who was so dear to His Highness couldn't survive the story and marry His Highness. The prince waved away the fact that he was going to vomit at the sight. The girl understood him, because imagining something in your head and seeing it in person were not the same thing. Still, he must be in a lot of pain right now. She had to distract the prince somehow. Then Sonidor told Marmel not to think bad thoughts and to look at her. She thought of nothing better to do than to show a ridiculous dance technique called the log dance, which she said was testing the wooden boundaries of all humanity. The girl started dancing silly, continuing her monologue about how it was her thing, and even remembered being told once as if she had no joints at all. The prince chuckled and remarked that Sonidor really couldn't dance. That was a shame for the girl. She added that she also knew the cobra dance, but Marmel realized she was trying to comfort him. He asked bluntly if she was worried about him. After a little silence, the girl climbed onto His Majesty's knee and, resting her paws on his arm, said that she was. However, one does not ask such things. The prince smiled and began to squeeze the poor animal again, saying he would have locked that cute little face up like that. He asked if she could turn into animals in real life, to which the girl said she couldn't do that, even with a polymorph. But it suddenly dawned on her that this was a chance to find a reliable defense in the person of the crown prince. She exclaimed that she would always be an animal in his dreams. With a twinkle in her eye, the craftswoman babbled that when the prince returned, she would not stop sleeping. She really hoped he would agree. Marmel thought about it and got out of bed. He had never thought before that they would be able to see each other every night before going to bed, so he could squeeze her as much as he wanted. Oh, and the girl is good with him and filigree at comforting him. He recognized that being nice was also a skill. Marmel put the animal on the table and scratched behind its ear. A thought popped into his head that might work. He said he could probably get by with her. Sidor didn't understand. Then Marmel picked up the pendant with the heart and said that this was the source, only there was no reaction from him yet. The prince knew what the reason was. Then he threw this pendant in front of him. The room was immediately plunged into darkness, and everything around her disappeared, seemingly motionless in its place. Sidor lost sight of His Highness and thought she was just about to wake up suddenly, but she was wrong. She started to run nowhere and called desperately for Marmel, asking him to answer her, when she ran into something solid. It was the prince, holding her close and comforting her with his presence. Sidor climbed onto His Highness's shoulder and pressed herself against his cheek, in fear of the impenetrable darkness, tickling him. She looked around and tried to figure out where they'd gotten to this time, hoping they hadn't been carried deeper than the abyss itself. Suddenly, a blue light appeared ahead. It looked like the blurred figures of people. It was probably a memory. The master descended and looked at the source of the blue light, except that ordinary memories are recreated in the form in which the dreamer remembered them. Even with amnesia, they appear in full, because they have not disappeared from memory, but are simply hidden deep inside. This is not the case here, because the owner denies his memories, turning them into false memories in order to protect himself. This happens when a person rejects or evades his or her own past. If a memory is buried so deeply, almost next to the abyss itself, it is preserved only in such a blurred form. Therefore, when such fragments of memory resurface, many people take them for delusions, because the brain is already deceived by false pictures of the past. This is how the soul protects itself from pain and suffering. It turns out that this memory is really important, but at the same time the most painful of all the memories they have already seen. Sidor had warned that they were facing something the prince would not want to remember, but he didn't care. He was calm and not afraid, because his guide was beside him. He stepped boldly with the girl toward the fire, and then the shards took shape. 2 men stood before the travellers, the prince's uncle and an unknown lady. The man banged his fist against the wall and resented that the serpent emperor had reduced him to the level of a chain dog, and now he had a leash around his neck that made it impossible for him to act. The white-haired girl told him not to hurry, because if he made decisions in a hurry, it would only make things worse for her and her brother. It was the empress herself who said that. The prince's uncle argued that Marmel had grown up to be very intelligent and could grasp everything as if he were gifted beyond his years. He was sure that he would follow in his father's footsteps and become a righteous ruler who shared their interests. The empress sighed and wondered if she should be reminded of what had happened to the horns. She added that only Valent's family was left on their side, so it was better to wait until the girl was an official bride. Otherwise, the end of everyone involved. The empress demanded that her brother be patient and wait at least until the end of the ceremony, when Marmel would be handed over the powers. Sidor was shocked at what she heard, not understanding what they were saying. Shards of memories can be shattered, but they can't be faked. It would be clear to anyone that the 2 of them were scheming, and those twins, the girl from the Valant family, Gabby, all those children, were involved in treason. Thus confirmed the emperor's morbid suspicion, which Sidor felt as if she had sensed. She could not accept that all those who were at His Majesty's side really knew something. Suddenly, she felt that her strength was running out again. Coughing and holding her head, she told the prince that she had to go. Marmel said he understood, and anyway what they had seen was only a hallucination. a false illusion. After some silence, he asked not to leave him here, alone in the dark. At that moment, the girl realized that she had to hurry. She exclaimed that she would disappear for a short while and would be back in a moment, and raised her paw up, giving her word. And though His Highness's face could not be seen in that pitch darkness, she felt, by his trembling voice and the drops on his hand, when she touched him, that Marmel was crying. Some time passed in the real world, and here we see the dream again. Sonidor struggled to get up, but nothing worked, for she, a human being, was crushed by a real elephant. She tried to shout to the animal, but suddenly she saw the figure of a prince dressed in a rather eccentric costume approaching her. She tried to shout to the animal when she saw the prince, dressed in a rather flamboyant costume. But it turned out he had come over to look at the elephant. He told her to be patient for the sake of making the elephant comfortable. The animal, though it looked like a toy, was still heavy. The prince said that animals are always right, and therefore it is not worth upsetting them with your human ignorance. And then he asked the elephant to give him a ride on his back with a completely serious face. To think he turned his back on Sonidor as soon as she became human. A real tyrant. At the cheerful sounds of the elephant, the picture darkened, and the master rose from her bed in the real world, insulting the heavy animal in every possible way. It turned out that we had seen Sonidor's dream. When she realized it was just a dream, she flopped back on the bed with relief. But somehow she was still upset, perhaps knowing in her heart that the prince would have done the same to her. With tears in her eyes, she looked at the figure blocking the light. It was Christian, who had come up to check on the master's progress. Earlier, he had kicked the healer and Terry out of the door because they were too noisy. But looking at the girl shaking with weakness and pain, he was about to call them back. Sonidor refused, reasoning that if they were asleep, there was no need to wake them for her. Her body ached, but she had slept well. It was this state that surprised her, for it should not be so. Sonidor called out to the knight and asked how long she had slept. He hesitated and said uncertainly that she had slept a day, perhaps 2. The knight hesitated and said uncertainly that it was a day or perhaps 2. The girl was shocked. She blamed herself for leaving him alone in the darkness crying, and she had slept on her own. A master of sleep should not leave the master of sleep for so long, otherwise it would turn out badly. Sonidor stood up and said she had to go back. The knight insisted she discuss it with Terry first and gagged the girl with food. Spoon-feeding her like a child, he wailed that she needed to eat, even if time was short. He added that while she slept, her empty stomach serenaded the entire empire with food, even though she couldn't hear it. Oh, and she could use some rest right now. The man placed the tray of food in front of the girl and said he would call Terry and the healer. Sonidor leaned over to the knight and exclaimed that she could not leave His Highness alone, crying alone. Christian said, embarrassed, that the prince, though quiet, was not a sissy at all. The girl was outraged and said that a stale man like him had no right to judge anyone. The knight waved her away and said he would bring help while she ate. He added that he was as worried about His Highness as the master was, but reminded her that she would need her strength to deal with a situation so critical according to the master. Her well-being now directly affects the well-being of His Highness. Sonidor thought for a moment. Christian, though he spoke in a way that sent a chill down her spine, was absolutely right. Because of her impatience, she could not be near the prince when he needed her more than ever. After a while, Terry ran into the room and hugged his mistress, babbling that he was very worried about her, for this was the first time she had not woken up for so long. The girl apologized softly, to which her assistant again attacked her with questions as to whether she had eaten, and then wailed that there was a lack of dessert, without which the mistress was sure to remain hungry. After a good rest, the mistress was ready to dive back into the heir's mind. Terry asked mistress not to strain herself so much anymore. Sonidor replied with a smile on her face that she was well rested, and there wasn't much time left. Only a week, and then it would be whatever happens. We must hurry. Master unbuttoned Marmel's shirt. If he was still in the far reaches of his subconscious, it wouldn't be easy to make contact. Indeed, the old way was no longer working. There was nothing left to do but lie directly on top of the prince and press my cheek against his chest. It worked this time. Before Sonidor appeared, she had only prayed that this time she would turn out to be a large animal, no smaller than a savannah cat. It was dark all around, just as it had been when the girl had left. It looked like the prince had been sitting here alone all this time. Sonidor was distracted by the fact that her body was now quite large, and there was some pink jelly on her paws. Marmel's voice came from behind, and he noticed that the girl was now in the body of an Amur tiger. He sat behind him and looked at the big cat without any sympathy. At first, she didn't understand why he was reacting so strangely to her long-awaited arrival. Then she realized that she didn't look cute at all, but dangerous. In the darkness, the tiger's fangs gleamed like real blades, and its breath was so strong it blew the dazed prince's hair back. He did not answer for a long time, and then reached out his hand to the furry muzzle of the beast, and scratching behind the tiger's ear, said that he had nearly gone mad while he was waiting for his guide to return. Marmel jokingly told her to try not to eat him accidentally by opening the tiger's huge mouth with her hands. The girl was indignant. Although she was in the form of a predator, she did not want to eat human flesh. However, the prince, with all his love for animals, would naturally be wary of such a beast. His Highness hugged his master, nuzzling his nose into the fur around her neck. He was unaccustomed to such a size, and he admitted that he liked the smaller animals better, and though there was more fur, it was coarser and stiffer. But he seemed to like that too. Marmel settled down on the tiger, using his belly as a pillow and running his hands over the big tail, asked if they could get out of here. The answer was yes, and the scheme was the same: find the source. The prince was bored with this. He pointed to the sudden memory and said that he had seen this picture hundreds of times and found nothing, but he had memorized the sequence of phrases by heart. The memory seemed unfamiliar to Sonidor. She probably hadn't finished watching it last time. The same two people appeared before the couple, the empress and her brother, who wasn't going to waste another second after the ceremony. The empress objected that the prince was only 13, and therefore he should not hurry, because it could be to everyone's detriment. But his uncle could not be persuaded. He was convinced that his young age was not a problem. Even on the contrary, as long as he was a child, he would be much more obedient. Marmel's mother was ready to object that her son's reputation would crumble, but her brother took her by the shoulders and shouted that she would not gain power by worrying about such trivialities. This was a chance to make Marmel their tool, young and inexperienced, but just now useful. She was horrified. These two wanted to put a puppet prince on the throne. The flashback, meanwhile, was not over. The empress continued to hesitate, realizing that the prince would grow up and most likely turn away from them. But this argument was not convincing to Alejandro. He was determined to act without thinking of such consequences, not to give up and follow the hornets. In a sinister tone, his uncle asked the empress how long she would pretend to be a righteous man. It turns out that both were strongly opposed to the emperor. Neither the empress nor her brother was satisfied with the concentration of power in the hands of the monarch alone. They were planning a coup to put the prince on the throne and seize a piece of power by his hands. There was only one feeling that drove them: the lust for power. Both of them did not care at all about the problems of the people, and certainly not about masters like Sonidor herself. The people were just a resource for them, useful for achieving certain goals. They may not have chopped off heads left and right like the emperor, but the empress and her brother found another way to torture the young prince. He had been betrayed by all the people he trusted. Marmel leaned back unhappily and lay back on the tiger, crossing his arms over his chest. As the memory ended, he repeated that he didn't understand the location of the source, and he didn't know what to look for either. Sonidor was interested in His Highness's well-being. He had replayed the nightmare hundreds of times. He admitted that it had been painful at first, but after a couple hundred times, he had gotten used to it. With those words, the prince hugged the tiger again. Sonidor jumped up from her seat. They couldn't stay here, or the same shards would continue to haunt them. Growling, she grabbed the prince by the scruff of his neck and threw him on her back, saying she would get him out of here. Marmel wrapped his arms around the tiger's neck, and they rushed forward together. If it wasn't the deepest part of their subconscious, they would find a way out. But the road seemed endless because of the darkness. Sonidor collapsed to the floor with exhaustion. Marmel assumed with a bored look on his face that they were treading water. They were. There was no way out of here. There was only one thing left to do, and that was for the prince himself to know. She asked him to tell her the truth about something, but Marmel waved him away and refused. Then the girl fell childishly to the floor and began to laugh and shout that she was going to die if she didn't get her way. And now the prince didn't trust her. Marmel smiled at the girl's exclamation. Though she had changed her appearance, she had not changed inwardly at all. He scratched her behind the ear and said that even as a tiger she was cute. Or perhaps she was just the way she was. Briefly, the prince hovered over the beast's muzzle, looking into its eyes. Sonidor instantly calmed down and looked into the deep scarlet eyes of His Highness, confused and silently waiting for something. And then the masteress suddenly struck the prince's face with her paw, throwing him backwards. She could have thrown him all the way to the abyss, so she was trembling and worried, recovering from the shock. The defeated Marmel lay for a while on the floor and sneered that with the next compliment the tigress would bite his head off. When he got up, he put his hand to his sore cheek and asked to be careful, for he was a fragile man after all. Of course, compared to tigers, any man would seem fragile, but this could not be said about the prince, which became clear during the period of communication with him. You bet to defeat a dragon with a single swing. Marmel asked if physical attacks would work against these endlessly appearing silhouettes of memories. Sonidor replied that of course not, since they were just illusions. She asked if the prince remembered that the shards were remnants of memories. Let's say His Highness had a magical device with records on it, found it by accident, looked through it, and wanted to get rid of it. Marmel replied that in that case he would simply smash it to pieces so that the records could not be restored, which horrified the master. She could not, after all, do the same to His Highness's head. Marmel looked at the girl with contempt and added that he didn't mean that at all, and that her bloodthirsty tiger nature was making up the meaning for her. He just wanted Sonidor to erase his memory. She said that she couldn't destroy the memories completely. Then the prince suggested that they try to change their content, which made the girls think. In other words, to write over the old with the new. It was a really good idea. You could simply create new shards. It would require new, more emotionally powerful memories, which would eclipse the ones lurking in the most secret corners of the inner world. There was one thing, however. The master asked the prince if he was sure of his decision, because the memories from this place would disappear. Marmel didn't mind. At least he didn't want to watch the theatre of two actors forever. Then the two set about creating a new memory that would override the old one. The master immediately suggested the idea of putting his head in her mouth, and unforgettable sensations were guaranteed. But the prince asked for a more adequate and reasonable plan. He also offered to ride His Highness on his back, but he didn't listen and asked why the weather changed each time she left and came back. Sonidor told him that the territory of the sky was the domain of the master of dreams. That is, she could change the dream a little. However, after the master herself falls asleep, there is little she can do to influence the process, and in her power only to predict her own awakening. Although in other people's dreams, Sonidor is like a fish in water, the main tone is set by the owner, relying on feelings and what he has seen. It turns out that the territory of the master of the dream is the earth. Everything that appears here is a reflection of the sleeper's consciousness, and even the entities are no exception. And then the prince had an interesting thought. He asked if Sonidor could summon any entities, and she could indeed summon guardian spirits, but only under certain conditions. The girl asked if the prince trusted her. He rolled his eyes. She continued that without his trust, nothing would work. It was offensive, but on the other hand, His Highness was understandable. His father had hammered it into his head not to trust anyone since childhood, and his mother and uncle had only prolonged the oil on the fire. Not surprisingly, any step toward the other was unsettling. Marmel was surprisingly quick to agree to confide in the master because she had asked, which shocked her. Then it was as if the previous reasoning had been overturned. The prince was quite gullible. Sonidor allowed it, but warned that the call of the guardian spirits would not work on the first whistle. Suddenly, however, golden butterflies fluttered around His Highness. The craftswoman could not believe her eyes, for what was happening was impossible in theory, for the emperor kept terrorizing his son with thoughts of betrayal. Marmel said that he was not his father, so he did not suspect others without a good reason. He also added that he is not serious about trust and can change his mind at any time, so the mastermind should not rejoice ahead of time. All around, everything was flooded with light, and fluttering guardians circled near the couple. Sonidor was amazed at what she was seeing and didn't understand how such trust could be called superficial. Guardian spirits are fairly common beings among the people of Descensia from legends. They reflect the gift of the wielder, but are quite rare, hence why they are reduced to a tale. You can only obtain a guardian spirit by fulfilling certain conditions, and for each master they are different, as well as the appearance of the spirit. For example, for the master of dreams, the condition is the trust of the master of the dream. Sonidor let the light lilac butterfly land on her finger with trepidation. It had been so long since she had seen her perfume that she was surprised to see it soon. The stronger the trust of the dream master, the more guardian spirits the master has. This allows to use the gift to the maximum. And if it was a superficial trust, then what was sincere faith in the prince's understanding? The girl could only guess. Both were mesmerized by the airy dance of the butterflies that created glittering curls as they fluttered after each other. The surroundings transformed, and the couple found themselves in a garden full of blossoming peach trees. Marmel grinned and said, savoring the scent of the inflorescences, Sonidor's perfume was beautiful to match her name. He looked at the girl with a gentle smile, embarrassing her again. Sonidor turned away unhappily, pondering her next unreasonable thought. The prince asked why she was so downcast, and the master replied that she had simply misunderstood everything again. She thought it was strange that the prince trusted her so easily, but it turned out that he just wanted to look at the spirits, because they were animals too. His Highness interrupted her thoughts, catching a flower by the tiger's ear and asking her what she had misunderstood. Sonidor's heart was ready to jump out of her chest. She covered her muzzle with her paw, holding back laughter and wondering whether to call a prince who believed in animals so much a pet or a verjivun. Having calmed down a bit, but still holding back, the masteress said that they had managed to escape from the depths of His Highness's subconscious, thanks to animal, that is, living faith. Marmel caught a hint of sarcasm in Sonidor's voice, but she denied it, making another pun. The prince stood up and asked if they should have left the dream world by now, but she repeated that the source was still necessary. They were simply lifted back from the depths of his subconscious, and all thanks to his great faith in animals, which even summons spirits. At these words, Marmel realized finally that he was being mocked. Sonidor thought that the prince was right about something, for she herself had said that he could come to his senses if he could find the source in the furthest reaches of his subconscious. But thanks to the spirits, they were back to the beginning, and there was no turning back. And His Highness's memories were correspondingly overridden by the guardians as well. The question remained as to where to go next. The master answered that there was no sense to return to the depths, so it would be necessary to look for an equivalent way to the past source. Sonidor recalled her words, to look for support in people. Marmel sat down in front of the guide and began to repeat her instructions. He remembered something about sprouts under ashes needing a support to grow. Marmel padded through the enumeration, remembering and talking about a place or thing significant to him along the way, as well as some actions, beliefs, desires, loves, and faith. Sonidor was flattered that His Highness remembered everything so well. Then he wondered why his trust had not been the source, for the spirits had come at the call, and so the faith was sincere. The girl parried, reminding the prince of his own words about the superficiality of faith. It wasn't about trust. The only reason they had gotten away with it was because Sonidor was in the form of an animal. The prince, however, did not understand the problem, which infuriated the craftswoman, and she struck the tree in anger, showering peach petals on herself. She shook it off sadly, and Marmel, stroking the girl's head, said that he did not understand well what she wanted to convey, but realized the main thing, the basis of the source, is attachment. Faith is a consequence of attachment to some extent, and desire and love are in themselves impossible without attachment to an object. The prince laid his hand again on the tiger's fluffy collar. He confessed that there was something in the way of their affection for each other from the beginning. It was a formal and prim address as to His Highness. Sonidor asked how she should address the prince then, to which he suggested calling him master. The situation was getting even worse. His Highness was much more, and it wouldn't take long to become a real pet without rights. With gravity on her muzzle, eyes squeezed shut, the girl pronounced the word master in syllables, and the prince kept reveling in her open expression of emotion. It was all written on her face. He exclaimed at the girl's mercy and flopped down on the thick green grass. Marmel smiled as he scratched the animal's face with pleasure, but the degree of trust was already sufficient. Sonidor noted with regret that his affection was addressed to animals, and the fact that the conductor had such a look was a problem. Logically speaking, any animal would be to His Highness's liking, and he should love Sonidor specifically. At these words, the girl suddenly realized what a foolish thing she had said, and clutched her head, burning with shame and begging to forget what had happened. The craftswoman explained that affection for all animals is not really what is needed, as it is too abstract a feeling, and the prince needs to make her stand out from the crowd. Marmel smiled, agreed, and slowly leaned toward the tigress, looking directly into her eyes. He was convinced that he felt affection only for her. The girl stared into his eyes, mesmerized, and wondered what he meant. Marmel added that Master was no ordinary animal to him, but a special one, and he spoiled it all again. She was still not human to him. Sonidor sputtered in despair. The prince did not understand why the master did not like everything, and she answered that she was still an animal in his eyes, and it should not be so. Then Marmel affronted her with the question whether he should speak of sympathy as a human being. Sonidor confirmed these words, immediately starting to justify that she understood how it all sounded. All she wanted was for the prince to consider her like himself, someone like a human friend. That was what was needed. However, Marmel kept throwing questions at her, asking if she needed him to love her. For him, love towards a human and towards an animal were obviously very different. She understood this perfectly well, but friendship is also a kind of love. The prince walked along the peach alley, leading the girl behind him and admiring the blossoms. His Highness explained that he loves animals by definition because it doesn't require any special trust, because they belong to you completely, having no will of their own and depending on their master. And if you nurture and cherish them until the end of their allotted period, they will reciprocate without any doubt. But the question of why the prince had never gotten a pet in such a case continued to worry the girl. Marmel looked at the tigress with a smile and said that she was the only one he would want to take in. Sonidor felt a chill run down her spine at that statement. He would put her on a chain. A little while later, the master asked what about loving people. His Highness replied that such feelings for people required sacrifice. This confirmed the master's thoughts about the prince's delicate and romantic nature, though it could also be because he was still 19. Youth always made emotions and feelings more vivid, and the master, being the eldest, was well aware of that. Marmel went on to say that you can't buy a person's heart so easily, and you can't bind it by force, so unless you're willing to sacrifice everything for a person's love, the game isn't worth the candle. Sonidor, listening to Marmel's sensual monologue, could not take her eyes off his languid gaze. His Highness asked her if she was indifferent to him. Sonidor was puzzled by such words and began to deny it. But to the prince it meant the opposite, that she liked him. Such a talent for twisting words completely and radically. Her eyes blurred, and she replied that she had never thought of Marmel as a man, for he was fundamentally not her type. His Highness grasped the tiger's face with his palms and asked her to repeat what she had just said. The girl exclaimed that her heart did not flutter, and that was all. It was definitely beating from fear, not from the manifestation of light feelings. The prince wilted before his eyes and let the animal go. Immediately the world began to lose its former colours, returning to its previous black and white state, and the unfortunate flowers of death, Thanatos, grew under his feet, and all just because of the accidentally thrown words. Sonidor shrieked in panic, her heart beating in a way that could be felt through the ribs in her chest. The statement pleased the prince, who turned to her and said he thought so. The world instantly began to change back. The air seemed to grow softer, and the terrifying flowers disappeared. Then Marmel suggested that they call him Mele, if the mistress disliked the word master so much. Listening to this, the girl only now noticed the trees around her. These peaches must have been created by the prince himself, but what they meant in the language of flowers she couldn't remember. Marmel called her name and asked if she could call her Dora, but it seemed to the girl that the name was more suitable for a pet name than for an affectionate nickname. And she didn't like Sonia either. It sounded exactly the same. All these lousy names were derived from her shortened name, Sonidor. She was stubborn, and looking contemptuously at the insolent man, was ready to agree to Sony at most. Now that they had decided on their nicknames, Marmel asked the girl to be the first to call him by his name. Here we go, she thought, and with a tremor in her voice, she called the boy Mr. Mel. Now all that remained was to remove the formality from the speech. The prince wouldn't let go so easily, and the emperor seemed to have a new reason to execute Sonidor. There was nothing to do, and I don't think anyone would recognize it in my sleep. It's no big deal. The master called the prince's name loudly and clearly, and he, with his head folded on his knees and smiling blissfully, called his dear guide Sonia. Well, in the end she was still Sonia, which was something she had to accept. The prince rested his head on the tigress's head, rubbing his cheek against her prickly fur. Marmel asked with a chuckle how they should go on, for the master had said that he should love her. She squealed that she had said no such thing, but the prince continued to mock and play up the situation as if the girl had forgotten her own words. He was just trying to find the source, that's all. Sonidor decided it would be better for her to be alone for a while. She could think better that way, and no one would distract her with silly childishness. With a smile, Mel looked at his guide. He knew he was joking, but he couldn't understand why he was so uncomfortable. He thoughtfully caught the petals of the inflorescences falling downward. The picture around him was already beginning to resemble a normal human dream again. So many ways had been tried. The prince was thinking more and more about what he should do to wake up. In the meantime, Sonidor had already approached him with a new question about whether the boy had any memories he particularly regretted. Without thinking, the prince answered in the negative, thinking that another conversation about the past would follow. The girl begged him to think better of it, for regrets could not simply be absent. It was impossible for human life. But there really didn't seem to be any such thing. Conversation was useless. It was comforting to know that Sonidor didn't expect Mel to answer instantly. He probably needed a little more time to think about the answer to the question. Most of the Dream Master's clients asked to dispel any personal regrets, at least in the dream world, such as the same Mr. Refons, who wanted to confess the feelings of his first love after 50 years. There was a chance that His Highness was more worried about the future, but that didn't mean it was okay to screw around with the present at all. And he always suppressed his emotions, so any manifestation of them could be a source. She placed her paw on Marmel's chest near his heart and asked him to be honest about his feelings. Addressing him by his name, she wanted him to put his feelings into words. Yes, Sonidor was aware of the fact that heir status hardly allowed for such a thing. But since they were in a dream, no one but her would know, so why not try it? It was easier than it might seem. The prince opened his mouth, taking a breath as if he were about to start a monologue. Just as he was about to say something that the girl had been waiting for, she felt the prince chase her out of her dreams again. It's worth learning a bit about the prince's backstory. Marmel Ricarian K. Arca. The word cogwheel, a simple mechanism doing a familiar job, resigned to its function, fits the description of his life perfectly. So much so that its cogs had worn off, but it kept spinning again and again. The cycle seemed to go on forever. On the day Marmel watched the snow, he thought about what was going on in his weary, mangled mind as he began to see the world in other colours. In his eyes there was only light and darkness, black and white. In a word, a world in which there was only murky greyness. He was so accustomed to this new world view that he didn't even realise at what point he began to lose his mind along with it. As he tried to catch the falling snowflakes with his hands and feel the cold on his palm from a melted piece of snow, he pondered how he was living at all. At that moment, the emperor appeared, noticing that his son was fascinated by the winter phenomenon of nature. First of all, the prince began to lose the ability to distinguish the faces of the people around him. First, it was the emperor, and then everyone else. At first, it was like a small blur, as if the person's face was covered by a drop of black liquid that had accidentally entered his eye. But as time passed, the size of this incomprehensible substance began to increase, until eventually it enveloped the whole body. Then the prince began to distinguish people only by their voice and build. Yet, For his own safety, he couldn't tell anyone about the changes that had happened to him. He had to show only the side of himself that people wanted to see. That's when he learned how people go crazy. He stopped trusting even his own eyes. Perhaps all he sees is reality or the coming madness. Even a meal seemed ominous when he saw black slugs crawling out of his plate. It is a well-known fact that a sick person cannot fully realize that he is going mad, so Marmel was not sure of the reality of what was happening. And since that was the case, the only thing left to do was to think about how to live on, not to drag his existence away. He felt like a living corpse that was just functioning out of habit, not knowing how much longer it would last. But the turning point was the day the Emperor first appeared before him, in the guise of a headless dragon. The ominous headless bloody sight, a huge carcass that spoke without a mouth, evoked horror and fear of what the air saw. Blood was spilled everywhere, and he froze like a stooped man, unable to move. A moment later, Marmel found himself with the book in his bed. He held his head, trying to remember how he had gotten here, if he had been in the Emperor's study a second ago. From outside, he heard a voice say that perhaps he should start reducing his sleeping pills, normalize his sleep and wakefulness schedule, and at least open the curtains to let the sunlight in. Mel turned his head toward the sound, thanking the doctor for the admonition and promising to follow the recommendations, as he discovered he was all alone in the room. From the moment the boundaries of reality began to collapse, Marmel was afraid to leave his bed. His eyes grew darker and darker, gradually sinking into an impenetrable blackness in which he could clearly hear the sounds of the headless dragon. It drove him crazy and kept him awake. The prince counted his breaths and exhalations to keep himself sane. Even if by some miracle he managed to fall asleep, he saw only nightmares in dreamland. A voice kept repeating in his head, telling him that his monster father had to be killed, stabbed through his heart to make him feel better. To believe no one, but only his own beliefs that the Emperor was the murderer who had broken him. Marmel longed to pierce his heart with a sword, to finally calm down and sleep. But it was the sense of humanity that interrupted him. He was ready to die himself already. The way out was eternal sleep, which Mel began to dream of from that moment on. It's better to sleep until you lose something more valuable. It's the best way to stay human until you die, and the darkness is peaceful in its own way now. So the tigress disappeared from the prince's dream, and then when she reappeared, he would claim that he had accidentally kicked her out of his mind again. If she's in the body of an even more fearsome beast, he's definitely screwed. Marmel sat down on the grass, leaning on his knees, and began to ponder Sonidor's words, not understanding why she would want him to be honest with his own feelings, for it could turn out that the mastermind would leave him when the truth was revealed. It had been a few minutes since the guide had disappeared, but the prince already missed her and waited for her return. He had kept her with him out of interest, because in his ideal world, she was the only talking creature. The girl is really cute, especially when she's making disgruntled faces, but she's also witty, energetic, and timely cowardly and brave, like all the animals she's come to see him as. Normally, Marmel could easily read the intentions of the people around him, so he thought it would be just as easy with her. But it was still a mystery to the prince why she was so desperate to wake him up. Unless it's to save her life, she must be being blackmailed by the Emperor. Marmel lay on the grass, looking up at the clear sky as if waiting for his guide. He had even gotten to thinking that he cared about her. An adorable little beast who is actually a real person with long red hair, just as she described herself. Marmel paved to reflect on his losses, which were due to his own folly and failure, and on the loneliness that had become his only faithful companion. Opening up to someone was tantamount to a death sentence, so it was more convenient to always be on my own and easier not to get involved with anyone. But for some reason, Marmel always looks forward to Sonidor invading his sleep once again, calling out to him, bossing him around as if he were at home, stirring up his half-forgotten painful memories. Now the prince was afraid that at some point the girl would run away and leave him alone with madness again. The prince was afraid that at some point the girl would run away and leave him alone again. Now, remembering the embrace with his favourite vixen, Marmel was sure that he was ready for anything. So his only wish was that the master fox would not leave him. Mel, bored under a blossoming peach tree, catching the falling petals, heard a noise behind him. He was called again by a native voice that he would not confuse with anyone else's. It was the mistress in the guise of a fawn. The fawn stood on trembling, dainty legs and stared straight at the insolent man who dared to kick him out the door again. Sonidor reminded herself that every time His Highness kicked her out of her sleep, she was in terrible pain and agony. Marmel took the girl in his arms and hugged her, asking her to address him by his first name as before. Marmel took the girl in his arms and hugged her, asking her to call him by his first name as before. Sonia was still pissed at the prince, and he apologized and promised that it wouldn't happen again. At least he would try very hard. She snorted with disdain as she sat on Mel's lap and said she would believe it this time. She was worried about something else. The deadline was approaching, and it would be impossible to meet again without a long rest. Sonia told Mel that this might be their last meeting, for the time allotted for the Emperor's mission was coming to an end. And if the prince never woke up, all dissentients, including her, would be exterminated. It was possible that the situation would change if she succeeded, but failure would prove to be a good reason for genocide. The prince was for now the only chance of salvation. Marmel didn't understand why all the dissentients were suddenly doomed. Sonidor admitted that people thought His Highness's eternal sleep was the result of an ancient curse. The very horrors of half a millennium ago. The thing is that the prince's case has much in common with what happened then to all the descendants of the cursed family from adulthood. From the outside, the situation was identical. However, Mel knew for a fact that those people did not show symptoms of insanity, and therefore the question of black magic being involved in the prince's case remained open. Marmel asked why the craftswoman had not told him about it earlier, to which she replied that it would not have sped up the process anyway, but rather loaded it with unnecessary thoughts that would have distracted from the work. There, the reason for the blackmail was revealed. Mel asked if the Emperor really thought it was about that curse, and Sonidor replied that he had only cited it as the root cause at their first meeting. But honestly, it wasn't like His Majesty cared about cause and effect. He was simply demanding her participation. Now the girl was no longer sure of anything, except that Marmel knew his father well. He assumed in his thoughts that it was likely that the Emperor was aware that this wasn't about the curse. The real purpose is to make the matter look and feel legitimate. And in case the prince doesn't eventually come to his senses, the curse will be the perfect excuse in the eyes of his loyalties to carry out genocide. It turns out he's still obsessed with the idea of a massacre, and all the prince can prevent if he wakes up in time. However, just as Sonia said, there is no guarantee that even after success, the Emperor will not touch anyone, and the lives of the dissentients will remain at risk. We will have to act according to the situation and solve problems on the run. Marmel asked his guide if she knew the cause of his eternal sleep, to which she replied something about common traits. Probably the cause was psychological trauma and its consequences. The prince, stroking the soft, fluffy deer's tail, asked if Sonia had shared details and conjectures with his father. Naturally no, and that was the best part. The prince smiled broadly and said that it was better that Descensia's curse remained the cause of his ailment. The girl was puzzled. His phrase sounded as if he wished death to all the masters, rather than wishing to help them. Marmel narrated that if one carefully studied the original historical notes, the last descendant of the originally cursed imperial family was Luke VII. He was aware of his destiny and knew that he would fall asleep on the day of his majority, so he searched with all his might for a way to break the curse. The road led him to an island where he learned God's will. The prophecy was rather vague and sounded like this: the end of the path will be laid by new blood, the blood that gave it its beginning. This statement could be understood and interpreted in different ways. Terrified at the prospect of his own destruction, Luca understood him literally and verbatim. He decided that he had to shed the blood of the dissentients who had put a terrible curse on him, and as a result, he carried out a massacre that claimed hundreds of lives. By his own stupidity, he had signed his own death warrant for himself and a lot of innocent people. And the girl remembered the story, which any dissentient had heard at least once. The prince decided it would be an excellent idea to use this prophecy to his advantage, interpreting the new blood as a descendant of the dissentients, that is, a master like Sonidor herself. In confirmation of these words, she would awaken him. It wasn't a bad plan. If the emperor believed that only dissentients could break the curse, genocide could be avoided. Sonidor raised her head to the prince and asked to save also her assistant, who is originally a resident of the empire. This was something His Highness could not promise, but he would try to fulfill the request. That was enough. It was decided to leave the thanks for later. The prince rose and said that he took back what he had said earlier. There's a good chance he'll have to risk everything he has upon awakening, and he wasn't the only one. So the first thing he had to do was get out of oblivion, and that requires the utmost sincerity. Sonidor looked Marmel straight in the eye and said that no matter what he said, she swore that her attitude towards him would not change, and she would continue to support him to the very end. After a pause, the prince leaned down to the top of the beast's head and whispered that he seemed to really like Sonidor. With those words, he kissed her forehead gently. He dreaded meeting the real girl, but at the same time he longed not with all his heart. Sonidor sensed the prince's excitement and asked if he was really so afraid of facing reality. It was true. He was afraid that everything there was still black and white and blurry, and that when he returned it would be even worse. She smiled warmly and said that she would be with him until His Highness felt better, because she had made a promise, so there was nothing to worry about. She added that she was already very attached to him, so she wouldn't leave him in the lurch, no matter what happened. That's how bonds between people work. Marmel blushed at her words and warned her that she could not take back what she had said, so she might regret it. Time to wake up. And it did work. Marmel opened his eyes and put his hand to his forehead, numb from his long immobility. Everything was as grey and gloomy as before. He felt breath and familiar warmth beside him. He put his free arm around the girl and fumbled with her fluffy hair, which was gathered into a bundle. It was frightening, but at the same time, it was maddeningly curious to see his friend. Marmel resolutely shifted his gaze to the master sleeping next to him, her head resting peacefully on his chest. She lifted her head, sensing movement, and revealed herself in full glory. Indeed, like a fox. Sonidor saw that she had succeeded. The prince opened his eyes. The two looked at each other in silence, as if afraid that everything that was happening was just a mirage. Marmel noticed with a soft smile that the master's head was in place, which he was immensely pleased about. He had a different impression of the girl than he had in his dream. Perhaps it was his hoarse voice. Sonidor, blushing from the long eye contact, said she would call a healer when suddenly she felt strong hands pulling her back to bed. The prince grinned, saying that they had just met and she was running away without saying hello. Stammering, the craftswoman could find no words and could say nothing better than the joy of Mel's awakening. He said it was all thanks to the guide. Marmel was overjoyed to meet her, kissing her hand like a true gentleman, not caring that they had already slept together. The idyll was interrupted by the loud voices of the noisy men who rejoiced at the awakening of His Highness. When Haggit finished his business, he concluded with the phrase that thanks to the supporting magic, His Highness's body would be fine. Due to the long stay in a coma, he would be slowed down for a while, but the ailment would pass quickly. As he buttoned his shirt, the prince recognized the voice of the court healer. He still couldn't see his face, so he used the skills he'd learned before falling asleep. Marmel had only minor complaints about the cutting light, so Haggit recommended darkening the room with curtains, but gradually letting light into the chambers. The prince noticed that there were 3 people in the room, the voices belonging to men. One of them clearly belonged to the knight, and the other, apparently Sonia's assistant, was just as boisterous. If you think about it that way, nothing changed in this gloomy, dull, and lifeless reality. Only Sonia brought bright colours and light into his impenetrable existence, as if using some kind of magic. Marmel was eager to get a closer look at his dear master. The girl noticed this, thinking that the prince had something to say to her. Terry interrupted her, asking her to hold out his other hand so that he could button his cuffs. At the same time, he whispered to his mistress that the healer was very skillful at pretending to be normal in front of the prince, using his healing power of authority. It was funny to watch Haggit's irritation at hearing all these comments. Meanwhile, Marmel asked the knight to come closer to him. He said he was aware of the time limit given by the emperor to the master to cure his illness. The knight said that there were only 3 days left before it was over. From the voice, Mel recognized Christian. The prince asked to report to His Highness on his awakening, and the rest he wished to announce in person after the amendment at the audience. In the meantime, he demanded silence. The prince's word was law, so the knight obeyed his order without question. Mel thanked Christian and said that what he needed now was peace. The knight understood and said he would take everyone out of the chambers at once. Marmel asked the master to stay next to him alone. When the door slammed shut, he asked her embarrassedly to come closer to him and tilt her head. The prince took hold of the ribbon holding Sonidor's unruly thick hair and untied it. The red strands spread across her shoulders, making the bewildered girl's face look more beautiful. Sonidor didn't understand what was happening, but to Marmel, it was as it should be. It seemed to her that he still saw her as an animal, not a human being, even though she was in her true form. The prince replied that this was not at all true, but then he should have explained why he was not at all embarrassed by the position in which they were sitting. Mel slyly pulled the master into his lap and enjoyed her company. Everything was within reason for him, but the girl had wrested her right to sit at least next to him. A good argument would have been the position in which she lay on top of him while she was asleep, but Sonia replied that it was part of the therapy. Otherwise, it was simply impossible to get into His Highness's deep sleep. Then Marmel decided to continue the therapy and rested his head on the girl's shoulder. Now he was freezing without her warmth and wanted his dose of therapeutic embrace. But his behaviour was like a child's whims, not the complaints of a patient. Sonidor asked why the prince had sent the others away, to which he replied briefly, they were all in his way. He wanted to be alone with the one he liked, and they would only be extra ears and eyes. Sonia seemed to be acting confused, but Mel grabbed her cheek and pulled her to him, directly admitting that he liked her as a girl. It was her and no one else. The embarrassed craftswoman stared into the prince's eyes for a while, then realized he meant romantic interest. And that's the real problem. In the future, Marmel will become an emperor, and the fact that such a man had feelings not for his real bride, but for someone inappropriate in status, a representative of the lower class, and a master from the captured island, will be a scandal. A real disaster. Only Sonidor has found a way to escape, as a new threat catches up with her. The emperor would kill her if he found out. But then she remembered that Mel was a romantic by nature, and therefore the feelings of such a man in love were not so serious. Sonia declared that His Highness was mistaken. He had become attached to her while she was in the guise of a cute animal, but that was no reason for love. The prince tried to stop her monologue, but the girl went on to say that he was mistaking sympathy for love. It happens when you open up to a person's innermost feelings and find comfort. Marmel grabbed the girl's hand and asked her to call him by his first name, as in a dream. He thought he had made himself clear, and wondered what else he could do to make Sonia understand his feelings. In his thoughts, he imagined that, if he'd had his way, he would have pinned her to the bed long ago to make her realize the seriousness of what was happening. He would have told her that she had asked for the utmost sincerity, but now she looked away. He wanted permission to memorialize her beautiful appearance, and should the craftswoman suddenly disappear into the darkness like the others, the prince wanted to at least be able to imagine her marvelous eyes. Well, Marmel knew for sure that the girl would definitely run away after saying that, so he agreed with her that he had rushed in, citing that he had forgotten what it was like to truly love someone. Sonidor supported him, saying that such things happened, but the prince still insisted on her company until he sorted out his feelings, for she herself had promised to be by his side until the very end. She remembered that it was a slightly different promise. She wanted to say it, but she couldn't say a word, not knowing why. In the meantime, Haggett continued to drive Terry crazy with a play of homemade but unexplained puppets of Sonidor, Marmel, and Terry. He jokingly played out the family drama of the new father's non-acceptance into the family. Terry watched contemptuously, and the healer only said he was projecting his unspoken worries. The master's assistant was so desperate that he was ready to write a complaint for insulting the ruling family. Yes, they were now on the same side, but why he had to put up with this madness, no one told him. Besides, it was all happening behind bars, where Christian had put them, telling them to wait for the verdict. Terry sincerely didn't understand why this was happening. After all, the terms of the deal had been brilliantly fulfilled on time, but the knight walked away, leaving the lad without an answer. The healer suggested that this was the time to shut their mouths. The prince was fine for the people's information, so the rulers would just have to get rid of the witnesses. Terry was worried for both himself and his mistress. She would probably be lucky, for the prince was particularly particular about her and would surely protect her, but he could only hope to stay alive. The healer stretched and hummed a song as if he were not in a dungeon. He stopped in front of Terry and asked, stone-faced, if Dolios was dead. Hagit told him that there was a great sage and magician named Dolios, under whose patronage a young unknown lad studied, who was so clever and talented, especially skillful in the control of mana. However, this powerful magician neglected his apprentice and did not teach him at all, thinking that he was not capable of doing great things in the name of Ark anyway. In this situation, the boy was no different from the servants. If he wasn't going to teach him anything, he needed another way. The apprentice who had served him for 7 years was not going to put up with such an arrogant and unreasonable decision at all. All of Dolios's knowledge was stored in a book that the apprentice had stolen and escaped. It could be considered as payment for all the hard work over the years. After escaping, the lad discovered a talent for healing magic and began training in the healing arts under the tutelage of an experienced healer, and then continued his way into the palace thanks to his giftedness and diligence. And the real knowledge that he absorbed, like a sponge from that book, it was difficult to even imagine, because after his death, Dolios left nothing of his research, only rumours and speculation. With those words, Hagit swung his hand and instantly opened the bars of the grate, opening the way out. So he had more than just healing magic, which the healer responded to only with his filigree talent. When Terry asked him why he hadn't done it before, Hagit also found an answer. If you want to live, you have a couple of aces up your sleeve. Calling the poor kid a baby, he walked forward down the dark corridor. On the way, the healer told me that he had other magic that was not too complicated and was completely within his control, such as elemental magic. With such powers, he could do more important things, but he was just a simple healer. The answer was simple. Magic is expensive, and its use involves mana that the craftsman has accumulated in his body out of thin air. In short, any craft requires a resource, whether you are a swordsman or a mage. From the outside, of course, it looks like everything comes out of nowhere, but in reality, mana is used up. And when it runs out, magic is not an all-powerful thing at all. Hagit opened the door to the chambers where His Highness should now be resting, to ask for freedom. But in no way did the two expect to see an intimate picture. The prince sat in Sonidor's arms, savouring the scent of her lush hair. It wasn't long before the pair had a conversation. Sonidor, blushing and averting her gaze, asked the prince what he would do if it turned out that he really liked her. Marmel was puzzled that even in such things the master needed logic. He just wants to be happy like everyone else. He remembered the words of the scripture that said that only those who know love can come to the arms of God without going astray. He asked Sonidor if Sonidor would take him down that path because he didn't want to go to hell. The girl felt as if the boy wasn't listening to her at all. Sonidor warned that a man of unearthly beauty should be careful with such words because it would not take long to pull his heart out of his chest. For more effect, she decided to squeeze Mel's hand and continued. If a woman of unearthly beauty said the same thing in front of the prince, he would be lucky not to faint. Marmel looked at the conductor in surprise and wondered if he was really so handsome. She only nodded, calling him a genius of pure beauty. Then the prince asked if her assistant was handsome, but he didn't get a clear answer. Two completely different guys can't be compared. Then Mel also got to Hagit, whose reputation was quite strange, all for the sake of proving himself irresistible. The girl said with a laugh that the prince was the most handsome, and it was not even worth thinking about. Moreover, this beauty transcends taste, so anyone would find it beautiful. Then Marmel leaned towards Sonidor and said that she was also the most beautiful thing in the world to him. The girl was embarrassed and turned away. She hustled down from the bed and said that the prince's taste was very peculiar. The girl complained of a fever because of the prince's hot words. The problem with everything was that, being an animal, she had a very different perception of the prince and her personal space. Sonidor said there were plenty of beautiful people, and to understand her tastes, she should make more acquaintances. Mel called her back to her place, but the girl tried not to forget herself. The master stated that she was aware of the presence of a bride for the prince. She had heard of the beautiful Lady Anderson, whom she had actually learned about from Mel's memories. And though the prince has no romantic feelings for her, the lady herself may be madly in love with him, and it is not in Sonia's rules to ruin other people's relationships. She said it's not good to act like that when you have a fiancé. It is wrong to her and to the bride. Marmel stood up after the master and asked why she kept talking about other people. The girl only replied that she would keep her promise and stay by his side until the prince was restored. She was interrupted by the stern voice of the prince, who had come close behind her. He asked her to turn around and look at him. Then the prince put his palm to the girl's eyes, imitating what he sees with his own eyes, and asked what she would do if she saw the world like this. Even people through this black spot, behind which it is not clear what a person looks like, nor what is written on his face. Even when a knight stands beside Marmel, called to protect him, he sees him only as a threat, a monster waiting for the moment to chew his head off. Slowly taking his hand away from Sonidor's face, the prince admitted that he felt similar on a daily basis when looking at any person. He wondered if the masteress were in his place, if she could see people in those blank faces and love them. That's quite a statement. It appears that the prince really can't see people's faces, and yet he looks the girl so clearly in the eye. Marmel took his beloved's hand and put it against his cheek, admitting that he could only see her face. He didn't know why, but it was clear that he needed her more than anyone to find peace. Gently kissing her palm, Mel asked her to stay with him, at least until he felt better. Slowly, His Highness led Sonidor over to the bed and sat down, pulling her against him and tucking his nose into her red strands, and then telling her that if she didn't agree, then heaven or hell was fine with him, as long as she was there for him. At the moment of this warm embrace, an angry Terry and Hagit appeared on the doorstep. In a whisper, the prince had just had time to ask his lady not to tell anyone anything, and to keep it a secret before Terry pulled his mistress gently away by the shoulders. The lad apologized for his impertinence and said he was ready to answer for it, but he could not be left without an explanation as to why his dear mistress was in the arms of His Highness when he had a fiancé. Surely the answer was that the prince had feelings for his vixen. Sonidor didn't recognize her aide, who had never even thought of such antics before, but now stood there with his back to her, protecting her almost at the cost of his life. Marmel asked him to introduce himself first, and then he would answer any questions. The boy introduced himself as the Dream Master's assistant, trembling with emotion. The prince told him to relax, for he was not going to punish him, and finally, to explain everything in detail, and he would listen to him attentively. The expression on his face was so blissful that it was as if an angel had come down from heaven. Then Terry asked in a trembling voice why his mistress was in His Highness's bed, and Marmel excused himself to the culprit of it all, the curse of Descentia. The master's assistant couldn't put together how this was related, but it turned out that the prince was ready for this conversation and had already invented a whole legend. He said that for some unknown reason, he could only be conscious when the dream mistress was near him. He said he was just guessing, but maybe it was because Sonidor had the blood of a Descensian woman who had been cursed 500 years ago. With curiosity, Terry turned and looked at the puzzled girl. There was a chance that she would be the one who could completely rid His Highness of the curse, so they are trying different methods. The Emperor would have to take that into consideration, so he wouldn't dare touch his son's saviors. Marmel thought it over, and even thanked Terry from the bottom of his heart for staying in the palace to help him, something he would not forget. Barely containing his worries, Terry bowed and thanked the prince, still not understanding what the point of the embrace was. What a coincidence. The healer behind him had just come to ask for His Highness's favour, and he had already found a way to save their lives. Admiring the prince's generosity, Hagit bowed, but it wasn't clear whether he was sincere or not. Marmel said that gratitude was unnecessary, because even unintelligent creatures could be grateful, and he did not dare to ruthlessly abandon the people who had worked so hard for him. The healer kept bowing and saying that he would never forget his lord's favour, and swore to serve him faithfully for the rest of his life. The prince looked so natural that one would not even guess his ailment. If his words are to be believed, he can't see the doctor's face, and it turns out he recognised him in another way, such as by his voice. It's a lot of work to memorise all those voices, And if His Highness does not confess, no one will ever guess that anything is wrong. The girl could not see the difference between the way he looked at her and the healer, even though she knew of his affliction. Still, there was a difference. When he saw her face clearly, it was easier for him to hold on, so he kept her close to him. Marmel stared at his beloved again, oblivious to the fact that someone else was in the room. The healer reminded himself, trying to guess what the mistress had done to His Highness in his sleep. And then he added that his beloved dream mistress seemed to be the only one who could rid the prince of the curse. Marmel, meanwhile, realized that he was losing focus on his companion. He shifted his gaze back to Hagit and tried to figure out at what point he realized he was looking past him. Perhaps the healer had guessed everything long ago, and even if he had seen his face, he wouldn't have been able to tell what that snake-like face was thinking. But such a strong ally would not be out of place, for they were needed now more than ever. Marmel changed the subject, asking the healer if the detection magic had found anything, for it was unlikely that Hagit would have come to the chambers without probing the ground. The healer was cornered. Showing his magic, he picked up on the prince's insight and said that everything was indeed clear, the best setting for exchanging stories. In that case, there was one question the prince wanted to ask. What was the real reason Hagit had come here? The company moved to a comfortable place, and the healer began to marvel at the level of mana mastery at the imperial level. For the prince had managed to create sunlight right in the basement. It must have required a tremendous amount of mana. Marmel asked to be closer to the case for lack of time, and the matter was not far away. Hagit was about to talk about mana, specifically about the prophecy that his great teacher, the sorcerer Dolios, had told him. A couple of days later, Sir Christian also returned and began to question the two shameless men about how they had gotten out. The prince covered for them, saying that he had rescued them himself on the pretext that Sidor needed help. After the emperor received the news that the prince had woken up, he reacted indifferently, seeming even disappointed that the mastermind had succeeded after all. He instructed him to begin preparations for an audience, but at that point it took 3 days. Sure, waiting for the unknown was stressing Sidor out, but it more than made up for the fact that she could finally rest. It had been a long time since she'd felt so relaxed with the feeling that everything was going according to plan. She was so excited that Terry whispered in her ear about her mistress's bulging belly, which made her very angry. He excused himself from talking about it while the dream mistress was busy with work, because there was enough stress already, but now it was already worth it to start eating a balanced diet. So much sweets could make you burst like a balloon, and then you wouldn't be able to fit into any of your favourite dresses. Terry cited the example of His Highness, who had already risen at dawn and was doing a workout. Like a little child, the girl stammered and said she didn't want to do the same. The prince interrupted their discussion, calling his master a sweetheart. Terry jokingly mocked that she could do anything, since she was so beautiful. And the third extra will be excused. With these words, the boy withdrew, leaving the two alone. Ever since Sidor had learned of Marmel's secret, they had hardly spoken. But she decided not to push him away, but within reason. The prince's insolent prince tested these limits from time to time. For example, now he was begging for a piece of cake, which the girl was eating so greedily a minute ago. Sonia endured it as much as she could, and decided that she would wait until the prince was better and run away at once. In between, Marmel complained about his poor sleep lately. He slept so badly that his eyes wouldn't close. The healer assumed it was because of the curse of Descensia, for His Highness had never suffered from insomnia before. He had to appear before the emperor tomorrow, but he couldn't go without sleeping for 3 whole days. The prince put his hand to his forehead, dramatically playing the performance, hoping to get his coveted fee. Marmel addressed the girl by her full name, a dream filled with precious shards of reality. Since she had awakened him, she must take responsibility. The prince looked furtively at his beloved, waiting for a reply. Sidor did have experience in curing insomnia, but it would take more than 1 day. But Marmel didn't see the problem, preferring that the mastermind just stay close by until she was done. It was another hint of spending the night in the same bed. He remembered that the girl had actually promised something like that when she was a meerkat, describing how she would appear as animals in every dream of His Highness. Besides, she was the only master of dreams in the entire empire, so she was the only one who could help now. Sidor agreed, but with one important condition: Terry and Huggett must be present. And so it happened. Terry sat in front of the bed with a disgruntled look, along with the obliviously pleased healer, watching His Majesty absent-mindedly. The prince said it was too much, and would soon see the two of them in his nightmares. The girl promised to deal with the terrible dreams. All Marmel had to do now was to try to sleep, even though he didn't want to. It was worth the effort, for even in a light half-slumber, the girl would be able to bring His Highness to a full sleep. It had been a long time since the room had been dark. Terry and Huggett had long ago been lying by the bedside, dreaming their 10th dream, which did not disturb the prince in the slightest. Meanwhile, the girl was already falling asleep. Since nothing was working, Sonidor offered the pillow to Marmel, mistaking it for a soft toy, saying it was usually easier to fall asleep with such things. But the prince insisted that she lie beside him. She still needed direct contact with the subject, so there was nothing to lose. Sonidor was already willing to do anything. She put the prince's head in her lap and rubbed her eye, remembering how she had put young Terry to bed that way long ago. Yawning, she began to hum a lullaby, so badly that it skewered even the sleepers in the room. But suddenly, the agony stopped. The prince opened his eyes and saw Sonidor's sleeping face looming over him. Lifting her head a little higher, he noted that she had promised to put him to sleep, but ended up falling asleep herself. Well, she's nice, which means she's allowed to do anything. Laying the girl down on the bed, the prince resigned himself to having to go in this state, wishing he had taken a sleeping pill, as suddenly a familiar, ominous voice appeared in his head, telling him that this is how the prince will ruin everything again. He's facing his father, and he's still as arrogant as ever, thinking he can prove something to him or run away like a coward. Marmel felt the dark, mad figure of his impenetrable inner world driving him mad again. The voice told him that he could not protect the girl anyway. His insane alter ego was bending him to finish off his own father again. He didn't mind though, because if he lost his dear master, it would definitely kill him, destroy everything, even his own heart. Thinking about it, the prince was startled by Sonidor suddenly jumping up from the bed, as if she had heard everything and shouted not to do it. The prince stared at her, startled by the sudden movement. Naturally, she couldn't hear his thoughts, and besides, she was screaming in her sleep. She ended the sentence by asking the unknown Joe not to touch the pudding. Sonidor lay back down, covering herself with the blanket. Marmel carefully leaned over to his beloved and stroked her cheek. Even he wondered who it was Joe was that she had promised to tear off her hands for her treat. Looking at the obliviously sleeping girl, he called her a ray of light that would protect her at all costs. After promising this, Marmel kissed Sonidor's forehead, saying he would be back soon. She woke up in the morning and woke up, remembering that the prince had said something to her. She looked around, but His Highness was not there. But as she pulled herself up, she saw an unknown face sleeping right next to her, hugging her unapologetically around the waist. She called out loudly to Terry, trying to figure out what was going on and how to make sense of it. The boy, peacefully pouring tea, calmly replied that it was getting on everyone's nerves, so they decided to put it to sleep and throw it on the bed. It was lying next to him, the acting teacher from the palace. It turned out that he had been sent here out of necessity, as the heir who had gone to meet his father had already come to his senses. At the meeting with his son, the emperor had once again started the caricature that no one should be trusted or show weakness. His words had left a deep imprint on the crown prince's subconscious, which had left an imprint on his view of the world as well. It was all about going to your goal by the head. This was the key to success and happiness, according to the emperor, who saw greatness only in violence and torture of the weak, in trampling the people around him into the mud. Until now, the prince hadn't had the courage to ask it to his face. He had preferred to eat away at his own self-doubt, denied himself everything possible in life, and in the end, simply escaped from reality. And now, Marmel was determined to trust. All to protect the one ray of light in his darkness, he would no longer run from the greyness of the world or his own father. Marmel knelt before the emperor and saluted the son of the empire. Silence reigned over the cup of tea. The prince listened to his surroundings, counting 3 or 4 ricel knights. To think, at a trivial tea party with his son, such extremes. It would have been easier to get rid of him long ago. Suddenly, the taste of the tea seemed too strange to Marmel. He immediately spat out the contents, fearing for his life, to which the emperor remarked that his son was probably still awake. The prince thought there was poison in the tea, but his father reassured him that it was just a new kind of tea delivered to the palace, which he had requested to be recreated. It felt like they had just mixed all the herbs together, no frills. Still, the prince set the cup aside. The emperor, looking straight into his son's eyes, ordered him to tell everything that was to make up for the 3 days of waiting. The prince looked indifferently at his father's black face and began his monologue. As the emperor had noticed, Marmel had not yet fully recovered from his sleep, so it could be said that the curse of Descentia still had power over him. He supposedly realized this when he felt better in the presence of the dream mistress. The prince also recalled the prophecy extracted by Emperor Luke VII. The end of the path will be laid by new blood, and it is the blood of those who gave it its beginning. Marmel suggested that it was a descendant of the caster, so perhaps the dream mistress was the key. The emperor was offended that his son would question his ruler's interpretation of the ancient texts, which was true sacrilege. Naturally, it all sounded like nonsense to him, and since blood was needed, an ordinary execution would suffice. Marmel noticed that the emperor's hatred manifested itself in his deafness and blindness. He disliked the masters so much that he would not listen to any arguments. There was no logic in such a decision. They would only repeat their past mistakes. The emperor parried that Luke's mistake was in not finding the very offspring of the devil's blood, and if she was their spawn, there could be no mistake. The craftswoman must be executed immediately. The prince tried to hold back his anger as best he could, saying that by killing this girl, they risked cutting off their escape route completely. Then there would be nothing left to do. But the emperor was adamant. He only teased Mel with the fact that he had never learned to hide his emotions. And if that was all there was to it, there was no point in continuing. The ruler waved his hand, trying to end what he thought was useless chatter. The words were a call to demonstrate his trump card, which the heir had stashed away. He remembered the words of the mage Dolios, that lunatic in the emperor's opinion, who had disappeared as soon as he ascended the throne. Well, he may be insane, but he is the most skillful man in magic and prophecy. All his prophecies have come true to this day, and this one is destined to do the same. The magician was long dead and had left no prophecies. The prince thought so too, but it turned out that all his notes and thoughts were kept by his apprentice, the court healer Hagit. Earlier they spoke of the mana prophecy, mentioned in passing. The healer said that mana is a resource, and like any other resource, it has a total supply that cannot be measured in any way. No one knows how much is left or when it will run out, none other than the mage Dolios. The genius wizard found a way to measure it, and learned that at the current rate of expenditure, mana would completely disappear in only about 30 years. Hagit also recalled how the teacher had stocked up on mana stones before his death, because he had foreseen her disappearance and prepared for it. The emperor was shocked, but he found a skeptical answer to that as well. The healer is probably too dodgy and wants to live, so he told them all sorts of things. Besides, his words can be easily verified by going to the place he told them about, and finding magic stones is not proof either. But then the purpose of all this mana for one wizard remained a mystery, because he had no heirs. It turns out that this mad magician really did it behind the government's back. The emperor thought for a moment. Only 30 years. The empire is held together by magical control, and without mana, they would face a crisis and then a revolt. People who depend on mana, even for their daily lives, will lose peace, and the world will be threatened. But there will remain in it those who do not depend on mana, and these are the inhabitants of the island of Descentia, wizards whose talents will belong to them for the rest of their lives, even in the event of the complete disappearance of magic. Marmel added that even before the student's testimony, he had researched the matter, for he suspected the problem existed, and now, thanks to Hagit, he was reminded of it again. The prince didn't want to reveal all the cards before he became emperor, but there was no other option now. He shared that there was evidence in an ancient language, even before the island was taken over. According to the scholar Ashev, who had dedicated his life to researching the origins of magical power, the very concept of mana, came from the name of the island. Another argument was that ancient manuscripts said that the earth was connected to the bearers of its power, the Descensians, and responded to their moods and desires as if resonating with them. Teacher Hagit's notes had confirmation of this. The mage wrote that the mana reserves were rapidly evaporating. No matter how many magic stones he had, eventually there would be none left, and only if that island could be rebuilt could the mana return again once the native tribe returned to the Holy Land and infused it with emotion. In other words, the owners should be given their southern island and left alone. The emperor thumped his fist on the chair indignantly, exclaiming that all this was nonsense and that all the masters should be kept on chains. Only then they would not dare to cross the boundaries of what was permissible. The prince objected that when the mages disappeared, there would be nothing for them to do, and then total control would await them, not the islanders. The ruler agreed, but Marmel felt as if his father didn't hear him, saying that outnumbered, these savages couldn't do anything. That was why the prince never tried to bring up the subject in conversation with his father. But it was too late to retreat. Marmel said then they should not waste the lives of the master all the more. That was the first priority now. And suddenly the emperor recognized his son's rightness. The governor realized that Marmel had prepared much better than he had expected. Now the healer had to be questioned for lying. He said that since his son felt better in the presence of the dream mistress, he had no choice. Therefore, he will spare her until the heir is fully recovered. Taking the golden quill in his hand and the paper, the emperor was about to draw up a new contract for the Dream Master. Besides, the Descensians were still a threat to the empire, but that didn't mean they were useless. Those words only meant that Marmel's plan had worked. The emperor ordered the prince to stay out of these matters, thinking that he was the same weakling who had grown up a bit. Now he was fighting back and looking straight into his eyes. He was interrupted by Marmel, who decided to add a clause on his own behalf to the contract. The mistress begged the newcomer to unhook himself from her, his dead grip on her not to embrace her. Terry was afraid of a slap on the wrist, but there was nothing to do but feed her sweets. Sir Christian came in at the screams and saw the whole ridiculous scene. Every time he visits people in this room, he sees something strange. He managed to free the master, and she stretched and thanked her saviour. She had an appetite, as if she were being guided by a spirit that had died a hungry death. Sonidor said with a calm face that it was necessary to eat even in the face of death, and that if she died hungry, her ghost would not leave Christian alone and would cling to him more than that actor. Christian responded to the master's whims with dignity. He simply ignored them, as he had done before. He was commanded to report to her that the emperor wanted her to come to the palace. It was an order. The knight put down several scrolls with newly drawn-up contracts. Each one had its own scroll. These emperor had deferred judgment, which meant he wasn't going to execute anyone yet. The luck was amazing. Both of them headed forward down the hallway. The girl's face was so frowning from being distracted from her meal that even the knight noticed something amiss. She joked that Christian must be afraid of her ghost, who would surely haunt him after death with that face. Sir Christian didn't appreciate the humour, as expected from such a dry man, and there was no cause for mirth. His Majesty drew up a new contract for each of the parties to the deal. The details were announced in the contracts, so everyone immediately rushed to read them, without waiting for a special invitation. Sonidor thanked Marmel in her heart for her efforts and opened the scroll. The result of the last transaction had been ambiguous. This contact indicated that the topic regarding the resettlement of the Descensians back was postponed for further discussion because the time was not right. However, the importance of masters to the empire will increase from now on. The most talented ones will even be given titles. I'm surprised that this greedy tyrant would do such a thing. But Terry's joy was boundless, for now he was a trainee under the real Knights of Riesel. Sonidor was amazed. So many rights, and all in reality. She had expected some kind of receipt, not this. Then her eye fell on the last clause, which stated that until the Crown Prince was completely cured, the Dream Master was forbidden to leave the palace. As long as he continued to show even the slightest symptoms of the disease, she was not allowed to leave his side. She also needed to be present in his bedroom every night to continue the therapy. It was obvious that it was not the Emperor who had written the last one, and the handwriting gave the prince away. Christian ordered them to sign if they were satisfied, but there was no choice. It was an order from His Majesty in the form of a contract. There was no right of refusal for anyone present. The last was that Christian handed all three of them each a necklace that is required to be worn at all times. The necklace is an artifact that has a spell to locate the wearer, and if anyone tries to remove it or destroy it to leave the imperial palace, it will immediately explode. Also, the emperor added that it would burn when the conditions of contact were violated. The girl decided to clarify the time for this assignment. She had 2 weeks to complete it. It turns out that the emperor prepared this contract in advance and initially did not intend to get rid of her, and they intimidated her for nothing. Christian escorted her to the door and said he would be leaving to help Sonidor's assistant and the healer with the move. Next, the girl is escorted by the maid, who is waiting inside the building. She entered a bright, spacious part of the palace, which she recognized immediately, for she had seen it in the prince's dreams. It looked much nicer in reality than in her nightmare. She was interrupted by a voice behind her. They were 2 lovely girls who had been sent to serve Sonidor. From now on, they would be her personal servants. Mistress didn't realize what she had gotten herself into yet. First, she had to clean herself up, and the most disgusting ritual was the tightening of the corset. The maids mercilessly took turns pulling the girl's waist down with ropes while she held onto the mannequin. The pain was unbearable, and it was even harder to breathe, and though no one had ever died from it, it felt like every organ was about to come out. Why she had to endure such torture, she didn't know. A little earlier, the girls had taken Sonidor to the bathroom, where they promised her a rebirth in their hands. After washing her, she was wiped dry and combed properly, styled and given a nice fresh makeup. And after the corset, she felt like a squeezed lemon, just right for the colour of her dress. Apparently, to see the crown prince, you have to go through the ringing process. The tired craftswoman looked at herself in the mirror, unable to tear her eyes away. She couldn't remember the last time she had dressed so expensively and beautifully. The only thing that stood out was the jewellery that the maids had asked her to remove. But Sonidor said directly that if she did, it would explode, and there were no more such questions from the maids. No one wanted to sacrifice their lives for the combination of necklace and dress. Protocol demanded such formalities, even though they were close, and even the maids had to report to His Highness that Sonidor had come to the prince's chambers. No one dared to enter without permission. Such was the heir's status. So the girl knocked first, and then informed Marmel, who was sitting at his book, that his dream mistress had arrived. To think that she was dressed from head to toe like a rag doll and had to wait for permission to enter, and she had no right to say anything against it. The noblest crown prince and a powerless dream mistress. There was an insurmountable difference in status that could not be denied. Sonidor entered the chambers, where Marmel was already waiting for her. She was as nervous as if she'd seen him for the first time. But not so long ago they'd been chatting on equal terms and cuddling in bed. The guy was walking toward her with a sinister face, and the lady could expect anything. But not that after greeting him with a cold expression, he would cover his face in embarrassment and exclaim how insanely beautiful his dear Sonia was that day. Marmel had no particular reason to entrust dear Sonia to the headmaid. He only wanted her to get used to the other outfits, for she would be appearing in public with him more often now. The prince wished to formally introduce her to the high society, and it would be disingenuous of him to say he didn't expect her to look so much prettier, even too much. So the reaction to her transformation had been appropriate. He praised her hair or her slim waist, in response to which she proudly recounted the agony of having her organs tightened and the hours spent in the bathroom. But the result was excellent. Even without all that tinsel, Sonia seemed insanely beautiful to him. It was a pity that she would not understand his words again if he confessed it to her. Then he decided that her natural beauty would be enough for the palace, so he gave some instructions to the maids. Among these was the rejection of the long abuse of her luxurious but unruly curly hair, and also of the corset, for it is utterly impossible to be in it. The maid tried to reason with His Highness, for no one wears a dress without a corset, not even the maids themselves. Some kind of suffocation cult. In that case, he ordered his clothes to be served to the girl. Sonidor had changed into a large white shirt and pants. Everything, including the shoes, was much larger than her true size, which looked nice and ridiculous. The only thing left to do was to wait for her to have her clothes custom made. The servants left His Majesty's chambers, and the prince began to adjust the already large clothes in which the lady had long since sunk. Why they had taken so long to put it together was not clear. With visible pleasure, Marmel rolled up the sleeves of his shirt, touching the girl's delicate wrists. She noticed that the distance was too close, so she asked him to pull away, but for the prince it was simple. The less distance, the closer their hearts were. Embarrassed, Sonidor looked away, allowing her to finish the agonizing ritual of getting dressed. She wondered if the prince didn't realize what he was doing. She was not one to judge him, though, since she herself had grown attached to him in a matter of days. While adjusting his shirt, Marmel noticed the necklace and asked where it came from. The girl replied that it was a gift from his father. The prince unmistakably recognized that the necklace had location magic. Sonia added that the condition was simple. If she tried to go outside the palace, disarm the necklace or remove it, it would explode. It needed someone of the rank of Archmage. The prince was seriously worried, but Sonidor began to comfort him, saying that it was a small thing, because as long as you didn't do anything stupid, it was no different from a normal piece of jewelry, just a normal precautionary measure. The girl was very optimistic. Marmel skeptically noted that even a hedgehog understood the danger of this thing, but in Sonia's opinion, there was nothing to worry about because she could do nothing. She was interested in something else, namely the last clause in the contract, which was clearly the prince's doing. He smiled, as if he didn't care that he'd been exposed, and explained that, as he'd said, he couldn't see the faces of the people around him at all. So, since the girl now knew his secret, it was her mission to help him, to be near him and describe to him what people looked like and what they had on their faces and other things. He put his hands on Sonia's shoulders and added that he would have many meetings with people, so it would be difficult to remember everything. Also, he hasn't been able to sleep since yesterday, hasn't even slept a wink. He would have gone to a doctor a long time ago, if it were possible to treat it that way. Nothing was working, so he couldn't do without the help of the dream mistress. Having said that, the guy sat the girl on the bed. Marmel crouched down in front of the lady and began to roll up his pants from the ankle, gently holding the leg to even out the length, and admitted that he'd had a lot of sleeping pills today, so there was a good chance he'd fall asleep tonight. He asked the flushed girl to appear to him in his dreams as before. In the meantime, the boy finally looked at the colour of the pant he'd been wearing before. This was what they looked like, and he hadn't even realised it. Without his guide, he would not have known the colour of the shoes or the fabric on which she now sat. Sonidor had learned only now that the prince was colourblind and that his world was devoid of colours, but that as soon as something was touched by her mistress, it became colourful. The prince's story described exactly the very first dream Sonidor had seen in his subconscious. Everything was black and white, no colour around him, and no faces or heads. He had been seeing the world like this since he was 14 years old. That's why he was so relieved on waking that her head was in place, and admitted that he could only see her face, asking her to stay until he felt a little better, an attachment born of desperation. And she was just beginning to hope. The prince wished that she would not leave his side for a second until he was back to normal. Marmel yawned and went to bed, and Sonia thought about what would happen next. Despair will gradually disappear, and when Marmel's world will regain its usual colours, his life will become much more interesting and rich, and there will be no place for the grey and unremarkable master in it. And if he did, it was unlikely he would want to continue whispering affectionate words of love to her. Sonidor rose from the bed, and ignoring the prince's call, stepped back, wondering why she was so disappointed. She was convinced that she didn't really like the prince. The girl herself kept him at a distance and looked for an excuse like fiancé or father. But deep down, she still longed for his tender words like a silly girl. The prince asked for a hug, but Sonia refused. For now that his consciousness was not tending to the inner side, such close physical contact was no longer necessary, so only a palm would suffice. Sonidor said she would wait until Marmel was asleep, calling him a client, and if he didn't feel conscious again, she'd talk to him then. Now it was time to go to bed. The prince agreed and closed his eyes. While she waited, she thought about the fact that it was her own fault for buying into his handsome and sweet appearance. The important thing was still to not let him into her heart too deeply. Her role was to help Prince Marmel get back to normal. That's why she has to stick to it. And then go back to her life, back to where she came from, where she belongs. Sonidor touched the palm of the dozing boy's hand with a wistful look in her eyes, sinking into his sleep. Thankfully, nothing had changed since her last visit to the prince's subconscious. The surroundings were still just as colourful, flowery and smelling. They found themselves in a large glass greenhouse with a fountain in the middle, watering the green shrubs. As it turns out now, Marmel escaped from the black and white mess into the same world that looks even more terrifying, a veritable waking nightmare full of creepy, faceless creatures all around. And even on that condition, he agreed to wake up. Suddenly the culprit took the animal down from the tree and said hello. So that's why the girl thought she was dangling from a height. She tried to take hold of Marmel's shirt, but saw the long claws and asked the prince to tell her what she was this time, not a monkey. He told her that she was a very cute little animal, a little sloth that can barely move on her own, but still a critter, which is what you'd expect from a fan of all things critter. In the back of her mind, the craftswoman was hurt that she would never appear in his dreams in her true form, but she tried to convince herself that she wasn't upset about it at all. The sloth's body was just too clumsy and heavy to get tired very quickly. She was about to fall asleep when the prince asked her if it was possible to sleep while sleeping, to which she had no answer, but she was very much in dreamland. Marmel poked her wet nose and cheered her up with a cake, especially for her. Then the headless maid took up the knife, which frightened the craftswoman very much, but she only cut the cake into pieces. The prince laughed and said that the maid would not touch her if she did not say any forbidden words. She had no intention of doing anything so reckless. She couldn't get far in a sloth's body, especially when her eyelids were lazily closing in the prince's arms. Sonidor took a closer look. The world was full of colour, but the creatures were still headless. One could at least try to visualize the faces, but the piece of cake she had managed to eat in her sleep made her forget what she was thinking. After chewing on the treat, Sonidor asked again what her purpose here today was. The prince reminded her that they were here to treat her insomnia. Time was short, so she needed to find the cause of this ailment. It usually appeared in her dreams in the form of a nightmare. But, with the exception of the headless creatures that had always been an integral part of His Highness's paradise, she had never seen anyone or anything so frightening. A good solution might be the practice of falling asleep with thoughts of furry animals waiting in her dreams. But besides Sonidor, there were no other animals in the prince's dream. She couldn't play the role of a pet for the rest of her life, so she had to think of something else. Then the craftswoman asked if Marmel sees animal heads in real life. The answer was, fortunately, positive. It turns out that he does not see only people's heads, but animals are normal in dreams and in real life. Then the girl looked at the maid and noticed that, because of her fear of her, she had never realized how young she was. She looked to be about 15 years old, and judging by her demeanor, she was extremely interested in the cake on the table. When asked if the maid wanted a piece of cake, she made an attempt to nod. It seemed to mean yes. It turned out that if you didn't make these creatures angry, they could even be nice. Then the craftswoman had a brilliant idea. She turned to Marmel and asked him to imagine the maid as a sloth. This was the solution to the problem, for he could see animal heads, so replacing a human head with an animal head would be a great start to recovery. In this way, the changes in the dream would gradually manifest themselves in reality as well. The prince, on the other hand, saw no point in giving the maid a different head, for in reality, all people had the outline of a head cast in a simple black shade. And even if she had an animal face, it wouldn't change anything, because her facial expression would remain a mystery. Sonidor noticed, however, that no matter how she looked, the prince always knew what was written on her face. She thought that His Highness's empathy was particularly developed with animals, so it was worth a try. Marmel pondered and concluded that it was probably not empathy, but the girl herself. But he listened to her advice. Mel said he would try to introduce Thompson's gazelle instead of the sloth, having desires to see this outlandish animal. Any animal would do. He ordered the headless maid to sit down opposite and said she was now a gazelle. Another sweet tooth had descended upon his head, and it was extremely difficult for such to not have a mouth to savour their flavours. Marmel didn't know how to present the head phenomenon properly, but it was worth trying everything. This dream is completely within its master's control, just like the same paradise. And if a lovely gazelle waited for him here every time, he would fall asleep more willingly and better. It was easy for the master to speak, but the prince had to give the head to the originally headless creature. Having no idea how to even do that, he covered his field of vision with his hand in the area where the head should be and tried to visualize a man with the head of a beast. When he removed his hand, he was surprised to find that the creepy maid was no longer sitting in front of him. She was now sitting in front of him with the head of Thompson's gazelle. It seemed to work better and faster than planned. Sidor exclaimed enthusiastically that the prince had succeeded, even though he didn't believe in his own strength. It was amazing, for now it was even possible to read the creature's facial expression. It definitely wanted the cake, which was clear enough. Sonia offered the creature to eat together, but it didn't respond, even though its mouth was already in place. You could try putting a piece in the plate, and then get a word out of it. The prince took out that very special pink macaroon, the palace dessert, and beckoned it to the gazelle. He waved it back and forth, as if to tease the creature, which was watching his hand with the treat. Finally, Marmel threw the macaroon somewhere in the distance, and the gazelle ran away with great speed after the sweet. Now, unfortunately, they had lost sight of all of Marmel's efforts. It was a pity to realize that, after all, it was the second creature with a head in his dream. The head, of course, was a happy phenomenon in this dream, but it was still a dream, so what good it would do was not clear only to the prince. The girl, however, was proving to him that he was able to change his vision at will. It was only in a dream, but gradually it would become a reality. The master asked to look at her. He sees her as she is, and it was in the dream world that it all began. But Marmel was convinced that it was only because of his trust in her. But both in the dream and in the real world, he couldn't shake off the guilt he felt from the realization that he couldn't help the people he cared about. He could not shake the guilt he felt at the realization that he had failed to help the people he cared about. And if the reason really lies in the feeling of guilt, it would be better to know the whole truth. Even overlapped memories sooner or later return to their place. But whether the prince really didn't remember anything, or just deceived himself, the girl only wondered. Instead of recognizing that the people he loved took advantage of his trust, he insinuates that he himself is to blame for everything. It's not even guilt, but a real fear that someone will get hurt because of him. But despite his fears, he still wants to believe, so the question of trust is still open to him. Sidor looked into the prince's eyes and sincerely wished that he could see the beauty of the world again, to believe in the people around him, in all those whose faces were still hidden by the darkness, to restore his faith in all that was truly dear to him. The dream broke abruptly, and the prince rose from his bed. He felt for the first time in a long time that he had gotten a good night's sleep, and his head didn't ache with fatigue. Rubbing his eye, he glanced at Sidor, who was holding her head, painfully awake. He noted at once that he hadn't kicked her out this time, but the girl didn't deny it, because today he'd just woken up himself, so she woke up too. Her neck was whimpering and sore from the uncomfortable sleeping position. Marmel said he immediately offered her to lie down next to him, but Sidor said it was wrong, no matter how hard he tried. She asked to let go of her hand at last, but His Highness did not listen, and pulled the girl to his lap to help with magic. It was a simple manipulation, so he was able to do it as well. However, he was far from a professional healer. Carefully, the prince began the massage, gradually bringing Sidor to her senses. Marmel remembered what he had been told about her fatigue during the sleep session. She had been so nervous that her hands were sweating, as if she were really overstressed. Then the prince offered to put her to bed, which she refused in great embarrassment, exclaiming that she would fall asleep as soon as she touched the pillow. Marmel laughed and turned away, amused by another reaction from dear Sonia, who seemed nice to him. Later he went to the open window, where a small sparrow flew in. Marmel said that while he was lying in a coma, a lot of things had accumulated, so he would be busy with work for a while, suggesting that the girl follow the head maid to a room and rest there, or look around the palace if she got bored. A bird perched on his finger, as he said he'd be stuck in his office until tonight. And the girl wasn't even listening, chuckling to herself at His Highness's dreamy appearance. While the prince was sitting on the window with the bird, he noticed a familiar carriage pulling up to the entrance. It looked like the carriage had arrived at dawn, and the people had not slept at all. He hastily called Sidor, who was peacefully drinking tea, to him. The prince threw his cloak over her head and told her to stay, but not to make a sound. At that moment, a familiar figure burst into the chambers without waiting for His Highness's permission. It was someone Marmel had not seen for a long time. Isabella Anderson. Marmel saw Sidor off and was alone with his guest. Pausing over a leaf of a houseplant, he remembered the words of his mistress about how she sincerely wished him to see again the beauty of the world, to believe in the people around him, and to see the faces that were now covered by the darkness around him. Sonia was too naive for him. It was just such traits that he wanted to correct in her. His thoughts were interrupted by his fiancée's voice, babbling about how glad she was to hear of his recovery, that she had rushed straight to him. The prince, meanwhile, had already taken a taste for presenting some animal head in the place of the missing one. To Isabella, he decided to appropriate the head of a wild cat. And this predator asked if he was angry at her sudden unannounced visit. Marmel replied that it was not that at all, for she had come to see him. The girl noticed that his eyes were also more expressive than the last time they had seen each other. The prince watched with interest as the cat smiled. The prince said regretfully that the worst was over, but that he was not quite well yet, or rather not yet fully recovered. To change the subject, he asked if Isabella had come so soon because of the rumours. The girl had heard all the gossip from her brother, but she couldn't believe it was true. It turned out that she already knew everything, but she kept on pretending to be innocent. The prince leaned back in his chair and said that the rumours really weren't fiction. He was under the curse of dysentery, and though his symptoms were much alleviated now, without a master, his life was still in doubt. Then Isabella blurted out that she understood the reason for that ridiculous order about the official recognition of masters in the imperial palace. Stuttering, she immediately changed her tone and explained that it was good that they were offered the opportunity to dedicate themselves to the empire. She thought it was too sudden to the citizens of the empire. Dedicating himself to the empire, now that is generosity. The prince replied that the masters were the only ones who could help him at the moment, and His Majesty quite reasonably wished to see this matter resolved as quickly as possible. Isabella asked if that red-haired girl was a master then, to which she received an affirmative answer. There it was, the look of a wildcat on the hunt. Isabella used various sophisticated images to get rid of those who passed her eyes in Soviet society. The reason that the prince turned a blind eye to this was his indifference, for he had no interest in her. But this time it was unwise to stand aside. He confirmed that Sidor keeps it normal and she uses a very rare power. Her Dreammaker ability is the only one in the entire empire. The girl thought that the red-haired lady was obviously fooling the prince with her own strength. To think that she had worked so hard for so many years to become the prince's bride, and now some master from the island had eclipsed her. If her father found out, he would reject her immediately, so she couldn't just leave it like that. Isabella immediately asked if she could borrow it from the prince for a while. In her plans, he had to answer in the affirmative, because he was just a puppet. But surprisingly, Marmel firmly and decisively refused, without even asking the reason, which astonished the blonde. He admitted that he couldn't live without her anymore, and even now he felt the withdrawal sensation overtaking him. It was unthinkable for him to part with her. Isabella seemed confused that the doll was out of control, unable to say anything. She didn't seem to be that smart, if you dig a little deeper. Marmel said that it was 4 years since they had been engaged, and asked if she had any feelings for him. Isabella immediately replied with a smile that she had the same love for him as before, which could not be expressed in words. The girl said such important things so easily. Nothing had changed one bit. Suddenly, Marmel realized that he and she were very much alike, and said that she didn't need to try anymore. With these words, he walked to the piano, as if he were going to play some soulful notes. Isabella seemed even more depressed to him compared to the past. She lived up to other people's expectations, like himself, which would never belong to her in the end, and she would remain miserable, even after fulfilling all the necessary instructions, not her father, Duke Anderson. The girl watched Marmel in horror, saying that she was originally no one's property, and herself realizing already that it was over. She silently endured the humiliation of the words and could say nothing in opposition to the fact that she had just been caught by the tail. She screamed to herself for the prince to stop scaring her. All plans began to fall apart in an instant. All the labor of 4 years was wasted. Denying all the words inside the girl, the prince coldly told her that there was no room in his heart for her.